All right. You all set to start whenever you would like. I'll start going ahead. Okay, so no feedback. Turn off your speaker. Yep.
Can folks online hear me? Can someone on Zoom just give me a thumbs up if they can hear me and see this?
Yes.
See my slide?
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. Thanks. Okay.
Terry, a couple of people arrived. Oh, right. We should do some who has not introduced themselves. She. Thanks.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay.
Who you are, where it's not going to 6 words.
Yeah. My name's Chichi. I'm from the Institute of Values with directors. Tobi. And 6 words. When will Neuromorphic bring out? When will Neuromorphic bring the world? You'll get it.
I mean, to grab us here. It's here. It's all to come over. Guys, like this. All right. Get up when we see it. All right. Sorry, I keep interrupting you as you start. So please go ahead.
Okay. Thanks for the invitation to talk. I think, as with most people, I was invited to talk quite recently. So these slides are what they are, given that. I have a newish lab. We've been around for a couple of years at the University of Rochester. We're doing lots of different stuff. We're doing a lot of work with intracranial recordings from epilepsy patients, which Nima talked about a couple of days ago. We're also doing scalp EEG and fMRI experiments and behavioral experiments to try to link up with our neural analysis and lots of different kinds of computational modeling to make predictions for our neural. Like a lot of people here, my primary interest is understanding the neural computations that allow people to make sense of natural sounds like speech and music and the other types of sounds that people hear in their daily life. This is an interesting computational problem because it's hard. And it's hard for lots of different reasons. One of the main reasons that it's hard is that the acoustics of sounds are hugely variable. So, even if you listen to the same, speech sentence, the acoustics of that sentence can differ in all kinds of ways. There could be background sounds present. You could be in a reverberant hall that smears out the signal. There can be spectral variation due to filtering present in the environment. And all of these things make it really hard to infer the information that is present in the signal. And additionally, a really unique challenge of hearing is that information is structured across an enormous range of timescales, from milliseconds to seconds and even minutes. And somehow your brain has to kind of flexibly integrate and synthesize information across all of these different timescales, which is extra hard because all of the different structures that make up sounds are highly variable. I'll talk more about later on. But despite these challenges, people are really good at hearing. Hearing is robust, fast, and flexible. And so we'd like to, a lot of people, maybe all of us, would like to understand the neural mechanisms and computations that make that possible. So I study the human auditory cortex. This is an inflated representation of the human brain, inflated so that you can see inside the sulci that would normally be hidden. My former PhD advisor, Nancy, she always described it as, imagine taking a brain, sticking a straw in it, and then blowing. It's a very evocative image. So this is the front and the back, top, bottom. And I've outlined the part of the brain that corresponds to the auditory cortex and responds strongly to sound.
And where is that on your head? Your own head? Where?
Yeah. Okay. So it's like I'm here. So front, back, top, bottom. That makes sense. So it's like right in here. So this is there are a lot of big sulci in your brain. This is the lateral sulcus. It's this really big cut along the side of your brain. So you imagine opening that up, and auditory cortex is kind of in that sulcus, and then everything surrounding kind of gyrates.
Just above the ear.
Just above the ear. Yeah, right above it. The auditory cortex contains different parts. So there's a primary region that receives input from the thalamus. And this primary region is tonotopically organized, which means that different regions respond preferentially to different frequencies. And this tonotopic map is organized in roughly a V shape within the primary auditory cortex. And this is not a new feature of organization. This is an inherited feature of organization from the tonotopy that's present as early as the cochlea. And information is then thought to be passed to surrounding belt and parabelt regions, which I will collectively refer to just as non-primary auditory cortex, because we don't have a great way of distinguishing the boundary between belt and parabelt. And a lot of my research has been focused on trying to understand these non-primary regions, which traditionally have been less well understood compared with regions earlier in the pathway. Although nicely, as I give this talk, that becomes less and less true over time. We know more and more about these non-primary regions. So some of the questions that I'm interested in is how these regions are functionally organized into different regions or pathways, what types of representations are contained in these regions, and how we can model the computations that allow people to compute those representations from representation earlier in the pathway. And answering these questions is challenging for a variety of reasons. One reason is that natural sounds are super complex. They have lots of different features and structures, all of which might be relevant to a neural signal. In addition, as Nima talked about, we know that even as early as the cochlea, the responses are highly nonlinear, which makes standard methods like reverse correlation often inapplicable. And finally, the methods that we have to measure responses from the human brain, like scalp EEG, are often really coarse and noisy, and it's often hard to infer what's going on from those responses. So some of my research has focused on trying to develop better methods, either analysis methods or new kind of experimental paradigms that can address some of these challenges so that we can insert some of these scientific. Okay, so I prepared 3 sections in this talk. We can get through any or all of them. We may not get to the 3rd section, which is fine. In the first section, I'm going to describe a statistical approach for inferring functional organization from high-dimensional responses to natural stimuli. In the second section, I'm going to talk about some new work that I'm excited about, looking at this question of how the brain codes information in the presence of acoustic variation. And in the third part of the talk, I'll talk about research trying to understand how the brain integrates across multiple times. Okay, so one kind of big picture question is how we should study functional organization in the brain. And there are people who have tackled this problem. You know, this problem is as old as neuroscience, and so there are lots of different ways of trying to understand and answer this question. For a long time, one common approach was to use a method like fMRI and to use contrast. So for example, if you wanted to look at tonotopy in the brain, you might compare responses to tones that have different frequency ranges. You might compare low frequencies with high frequencies in order to identify low frequency and high frequency selective regions. This type of approach has been useful. We use it all the time in my lab, but it has the obvious limitation that the relevance to real world perception is sort of unclear, right? You know, natural sounds are super complex. They have many different features, and who knows whether the particular contrast that you look at will be those that are most relevant to the neural response. Another approach that's really maybe become the dominant approach in the last decade or so is to use encoding models. Encoding models are everywhere. We've already heard a beautiful talk by Nima on encoding models. There are lots of people doing projects on encoding models. I don't think this needs a ton of review. The basic idea is you measure neural responses to some stimulus like speech. You then typically extract a set of features, and this feature extraction step is usually the kind of interesting part of the problem. And then you try to map them in some way onto the neural response, often using something simple like linear regression. This approach is useful. Again, we use it all the time in my lab. It's I think maybe the most exciting thing in modern neuroscience for me. But it has some important limitations, which is you got to know what features to test, right? Which is often challenging when you're dealing with complex natural stimuli. So I'm going to describe an alternative approach for inferring functional organization that is, you can think of it as more hypothesis-free, or more data-driven. The basic idea is we're going to measure responses to a really somewhat large set of natural stimuli from lots of different people. And we're then going to infer, using statistical criteria, a small set of response patterns that collectively explain the neural responses that we measure. And so this provides a hypothesis-free or data-driven way of exploring many potentially relevant response dimensions and inferring those dimensions that are most relevant to the neural response. This type of approach of trying to infer some low-dimensional basis set has been used all the time in neuroscience. It's often been used as a way to visualize neural activity. So for example, it's often been used as a way to visualize neural activity in motor cortex while an animal is performing some outreach tasks. It's also been frequently used as a way to kind of parcelate the overall cortex using so-called resting state connectivity to, for example, differentiate visual cortex from auditory cortex. But it surprisingly hasn't been used that often as a way to kind of study and infer functional organization within a sensory or cognitive region, which is the kind of novel approach here. So I'm going to describe a couple of studies where we measured responses to a diverse set of natural sounds that people commonly hear in their daily life. First, going to talk about an fMRI study, an older fMRI study, and a somewhat newer study where we used intracranial or in epilepsy patients. If sound works, I'll play the first 20 of these sounds for you. Rain or snow.
Now, how to?
Hannah is good at compromising.
Busted words.
So these are just a wide variety of sounds that, good.
How big of a list? How big are such lists that exists?
Well, nowadays there's huge lists, but it was an interesting the way I generated this. I think it's something somewhat unique to hear. You can't really do this in Vision. Is I spent like 4 hours coming up with a list of like all the sounds I could think of. And I could verify that most of the kind of, we might call it basic level sounds were on the list by just asking someone like name a sound. And most of the time, like 80% of the time, it was on the list. And then from that set of like 500 sounds, I culled them down to a set of 165 sounds by measuring whether the sounds were recognizable and by getting frequency ratings for how frequently people heard these sounds just with unlimited surveys. So these, you can think of these as some of like the most commonly heard recognizable sounds that people encounter. Okay, so in the case of fMRI is a really, there's a constant lag between us here and these show up here. Anyway, fMRI is a very coarse signal. It's very coarse in time. So what we get is for every 2-second sound, we get one number that describes the average response of each point in the brain to each sound. So for every point in the brain, or voxel just stands for basically volumetric pixel, so one little 3D chunk of brain, we get 165 numbers that tell us the average response of that point in the brain to all of the sounds that we tested. And we get a different vector for every point in the brain. And we can compile these into a big data matrix that contains the responses from all of the different voxels in the auditory cortex. We're then going to try to infer structure from this matrix. To do this, we're first going to take advantage of the fact that we know that fMRI is coarse. So every little 3D pixel here is influenced by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of neurons. And so it's natural to suspect that each voxel might be influenced by different neural populations in the auditory cortex. And to capture this fact, we're going to approximate the response of each voxel as a weighted sum of a few different component response patterns, each of which could reflect a different neuronal subpopulation that's influenced a given voxel. And in the case of a big data matrix, this corresponds to matrix factorization. So we're going to try to approximate the data matrix as the product of two smaller matrices. A response profile matrix, this guy here, that tells us the response of each neural population or each neuronal subpopulation in the auditory cortex. And then a weight matrix here that's going to tell us the contribution of each of those response patterns to each voxel in the brain. Make sense? Okay. In general, the problem of matrix approximation, which is basically what this corresponds to in statistical terms, is ill-posed, meaning there's always many ways to factorize a matrix that would equally well approximate the matrix. And so the solution, the interesting statistical part is to figure out how to constrain this approximation in some sensible way. And in this research, we constrained the solution with statistics on the high-dimensional voxel weights, which is where we have a lot of our statistical power. And in particular, we used an algorithm that maximized the non-Gaussianity of the voxel weights. And as a consequence, the method is closely related to algorithms for independent components analysis, which is looking at it. Okay. And so one thing that's appealing about this framework is that there's in some sense very little structure baked into the analysis. So the analysis is just operating on this data matrix, and it doesn't know anything about the sounds, and it doesn't know anything about the anatomy of the voxels. It doesn't know where they came from, or even which subjects they came from. So here we're just concatenating data from 10 different subjects into one base matrix. So any consistent structure that comes out in some sense has to reflect real structure present in the data, not structure that we assume to be present. Okay, so we found empirically that we could approximate the vast majority of the response variance across tens of thousands of voxels for multiple subjects using just 6 different response patterns. And each response pattern we found had interpretable functional properties and interpretable anatomical properties in the brain to visualize the weights. So for example, 2 of the components, these 2, reflected tonotopy. So they were localized to either the low frequency or the high frequency region of primary auditory cortex, and their response profiles correlated with a measure of energy at low and high frequencies respectively. So in other words, this helps to demonstrate that we can recover arguably the most well-established feature of auditory functional organization in the human auditory cortex. We also observed 2 components that responded highly selectively to speech and music respectively, which was the kind of main novel thing. And in particular, the music component was particularly striking because we and others had not seen this type of really clear selectivity for musical sounds before. And this component really responds in a kind of binary way to music, producing strong response to every single sound that has some kind of musical structure and a weak response to all of the non-music sounds. And if you look at where in the brain these 2 components explain the neural response, you see that they load on different regions of the non-primary auditory cortex. So speech has a hotspot lateral to primary auditory cortex in the middle STG. This is the superior temporal gyrus. And music has the biggest hotspot interior to primary auditory cortex in a region that you could either call, that overlaps the anterior STG or the planum polare. And then it has their kind of secondary hotspots posterior and lateral. So this suggests that the auditory cortex might have distinct regions or pathways that are specialized for the analysis of speech and music, and that the representation of these 2 important sound categories kind of diverges in these non-primary regions. My postdoc, Dana Bobinger, has replicated this in 2 new sets of subjects, including in non-musicians who have almost no formal musical training, indicating that this is not something that arises due to a lot of explicit expertise of film, but likely arises just from your natural experience listening to music over the course of your life. It's just the doorbell. That's not shit. Is someone going to let that person in? Yeah. Okay, good. There was some number. What? Yeah, the doorbell. I'm sure it was on the side. Okay. So there are a lot of limitations to this study. One big limitation is that the results are very coarse. We found 6 components across the entire auditory cortex. In non-primary cortex, we basically found,
How much of the data these 6 components explain?
about 80 to 90% of the variance.
And so it's that ratio. You said that there is no difference between musician and non-musician whatsoever.
I wouldn't make that strong of a claim, but I would say the organization is very similar. And it would require, there might be small differences, which would require a lot more subjects to really show that they're significant.
Surprising.
Perhaps. I think there are various hypotheses for what might drive the functional, kind of large-scale functional organization. One might be things like explicit training, over the lifetime. Another might be just your passive exposure to music. So I tend to think of, I suspect that the representations that are contained in these neural populations are the kind of things that just allow you to perceive music. And people have lots of rich musical expertise, even if they've never been explicitly trained. So, for example, if you listen to a melody from say the key of C, and then you hear a black note, you'll be able to tell that it sounds weird, right? And everyone can tell that sounds weird. That's familiar with Western music, if they don't have explicit training in detecting that.
Sam, can I ask a question? Do you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I was just wondering, the stimuli, the music stimuli that you use to collect this data, was mostly like pop music, or what sort of music was it?
All kinds of music. One of the coolest things about the response of this component is that it responds to basically everything people call music. Classical music, a single instrument, an orchestra, a big band music, a pop song, rap music, the sound of a drum solo, basically everything that has kind of a rhythm or a melody produces a strong response in this component.
And so, because then the stimuli that you're using are maybe not the best candidates if you wanted to do that, to pull out the difference between musicians and non-musicians, for which you would...
What you recommend?
What do I recommend for that? If I wanted to do that, I would take a wide range of stimuli on which people do get training when they get musical training, which is classical music mostly, with different harmonic complexity and things like that, for instance.
Yep, I think that's a good point. Yeah, I think there's a lot of additional things we could do to investigate those. I mean, I honestly think if we just got a ton of data, we'd probably see differences. And it's possible it might interact with people's exposure to specific kinds of music. Totally. I think that's
What I'm saying is that given the set of stimuli that you have, it's not very surprising to me that you wouldn't see a difference, because indeed people are a musician by just mere exposure, and we have tons of data already to show that.
I mean, whether or not you find something surprising, I feel like is your own. Everyone finds different things surprising. I don't know if I find this surprising or not, but I do think that there are probably differences between musicians. I mean, there must be differences between musicians and non-musicians, and I suspect that there are various ways you could go pick that apart. I think what this shows, though, is that the stuff I'm showing you is not something that requires extensive musical expertise. This is the kind of thing that's present in everyone, and that the kind of dominant organization is consistent and similar.
A very basic question: what are non-primary areas?
What are they? How are they defined?
Yeah, I mean, what? Because are they related to emotion, or what is not primary? How for their names?
I mean, you could think of it as having kind of an anatomical definition.
No, I mean, in vision, we have V1, V2, V4. What do they, these non-primary? And you have A1, A2, A4. So
It's always a little different. So, for example, primary regions have two areas that were 2 or 3, A1 and R. This is a difference. So, in the visual system, there's V1. And that's it, right? That's primary visual cortex.
One for primary. Okay.
But in the auditory system, there's kind of 2 V1s.
Okay,
so it's A1 and R.
Yeah.
It's a higher area.
And it's like my
you can. I mean, it's kind of. I would argue it's the end of the line in the auditory cortex. So you can maybe think of it as IT if you want. It's kind of like V1, V2, and then maybe V4 and T.
Okay.
Not
okay. So that's already thought.
Yeah.
Have you considered other types of, I like poetry that are maybe something people might listen to for enjoyment, but not like melodic in nature?
Yeah,
separate that particular feature out.
Yeah. We haven't looked at poetry. That's an interesting stimulus. We are doing quite a lot of work now on trying to characterize what things drive this component. So hopefully in the next few years we'll have some more answers to like exactly what aspects of pitch or rhythm or melody might drive these regions. But we don't really know at this point.
Right. So my question is related to the cultural differences. With music, I'm assuming that your subjects are all Westerners, right?
Yeah.
Music is also Western, right?
Yeah, although Dana, in her study, she tested non-Western music, but also produces quite a strong response.
In the same region?
In the same region. Not quite as strong. There is an effect. So Western music produces a stronger response than non-Western music, but non-Western music is way stronger than other sounds. Okay. So to try to get over some of the coarseness of fMRI, we ran the same study using intracranial recordings from epilepsy patients. So Nima talked a lot about this. I don't need to introduce it very much, I think. But there's this very particular situation where you get to record high-precision electrophysiological responses from the human brain, and that's from patients that have very severe, medically intractable, and focal epilepsy. So it's not being treated by drugs, and the doctors think it's probably or likely coming from hopefully one region of the brain. And in that case, these patients will, in some cases, consider surgery to remove that part of the brain or stimulation to try to quiet that part of the brain at optimal times. And a typical thing that the doctors will recommend is that they're not exactly sure where the seizure is coming from. The doctors will implant electrodes inside the brain to try to monitor where the seizure activity is coming from.
Does the size of the dots mean anything in terms of the electrodes?
Yes. So one of the things I wanted to note about these recordings is that the coverage is super variable from person to person. And so, for example, this patient has a grid that's implanted over the temporal lobe, and the electrodes are smaller than usual and much more densely spaced than usual. So the data from this patient is probably the best neural data I've ever looked at in my life. It's got like 50 sound-responsive electrodes that tile the superior temporal gyrus with fine precision. This is not the norm. This is like really special, unique, amazing. Yeah. In fact, in the Rochester, we just had wasn't as good as this, but we had a really nice subject. This is more the norm. It's a smattering of electrodes that happen to land in a couple of places of relevance to your study.
Another question which maybe Nima mentioned, but I didn't capture. Yeah. When these patients are sort of that month where they have the stuff.
Not a month, but it's a week or two.
Yeah. When they have the stuff, and then they remove these electrodes and put just 1 or 2 stimulating things. Yeah.
So their goal is to map where the...
That's right. I mean, the clinical utility of these electrodes is first and foremost to find the seizure, right? to refine their seizure hypothesis. This is how it's often described. And the second goal is in some cases to map function. So the surgeons are aware that there are certain regions of the brain where if you remove them, you could potentially have a very noticeable deficit. And so sometimes they will use these electrodes to also figure out where language regions are in the brain or where motor regions are. And what's really unique from the research perspective is that these patients, they're in the hospital for like a week or two, basically hanging out with electrodes inside their brain. And many of them are generous and are willing to contribute to science and will participate in simple experiments of listening to sounds. And it's really the only time you get to measure a high-precision electrophysiological signal from the human children. Okay. So what we get from this data is from every electrode, we now get a high-dimensional time course that describes how that electrode responds to each of the 165 sounds that we tested, which we can compose into an electrode by time, now matrix instead of voxel by sound. And we're going to play the same game. We're going to try to factorize this matrix into a set of components. This data has a very different structure from the fMRI data. So in the case of fMRI, we had about 10,000 voxels, and from every voxel, we had 165 responses. And here we have the flip. We have many fewer electrodes, but from every electrode, we have this high-dimensional time course. So it's useful to constrain the solution with statistics on the time course. In addition, the ICA-like analysis doesn't really make any sense here because with time courses, we expect there to be really strong temporal dependency between different components. And so a method like ICA really doesn't make any sense. So to deal with this, we first identified a set of statistical properties present in the data that we could use to constrain the solution. And we then developed a matrix factorization algorithm that was tailored to those statistics. I think I won't go through them in detail because I want to get to some other stuff, but I'll just say them quickly, and if they mean something to you, great. If not, don't worry about it. So one property is that the responses are almost always positive. So when you present sound, the responses basically always go up. They rarely go down. Another is that the responses are skewed across both time and across electrodes, meaning that the time points or the electrodes where you get strong responses are kind of concentrated. And finally, the responses, they're smooth, and their smoothness varies across electrodes. So to account for this, we developed a kind of souped up NMF model. So people that are familiar with non-negative matrix factorization, you could think of it as a variant of NMF. So we take each electrode, we approximate it again as a weighted sum of component response time courses. So again, these response time courses are the things that we're mainly interested in. These are the things that we consider like kind of putative neuronal populations in the auditory cortex. We're going to constrain the response time courses and the weights to be non-negative as in a standard NMF algorithm. And then to impose sparsity on the response time courses, we're going to model these response time courses as the convolution of a set of sparse activations imposed with the standard L1 penalty convolved with the learned smoothing curve. We show that this model can beat, in terms of its prediction accuracy, a variety of other models, and we can infer about 15 components from this model before overfitting to noise, and about 10 of them are highly reliable in the sense of being similar across different parameters of the model and across subjects, etc. So it's good. One positive thing here is we can infer more components, so we have a slightly richer description of the auditory cortical responses compared with fMRI. We showed that we could replicate basically all of our prior fMRI results, so you see speech and music select components. But we also saw some new stuff. And this component that I'm going to show you here is the most striking of the components that we inferred. So what I'm showing you here is a raster plot where I'm plotting the response of this particular component to all of the sounds on the y-axis as a function of time, which on the y-axis, which of time on the x-axis. On the right here, I'm showing you the average response to each sound, colored with the category label for each sound. And on the bottom here, I'm showing you the average response time course to each of those categories. And so what you can see is that this component responds extremely selectively to music that contains singing. Basically, every single sound, so we had 11, this study was not designed to look for song selectivity, but we had 11 sounds that contain singing in them. Every single sound produces a high response, and every single other sound produces a weaker response, including instrumental music and speech. So it's very suggestive that your brain contains something like a neural population that has a superadditive or nonlinear response to song. And it's worth noting that this matrix factorization algorithm is explicitly modeling electrodes as a weighted sum of multiple things. So if song selectivity just reflected like a weighted sum of music and speech selectivity, there would have been no reason to infer this component. And we've done a variety of subsequent analyses to really show that this does reflect a genuine nonlinear response to song. And so in general, this suggests that representations of music might be fractionated into different subpopulations that respond selectively to different types of music. And maybe the biggest split in your brain is between singing and not singing. So we'd like to look at the anatomy of this component. This is harder with ECOG data because, again, the spatial coverage of ECOG is really bad. So to try to look at this, we leveraged the fact that we had a data set of fMRI responses to the same sounds. So Tia, for example, is working on a project that's trying to do something similar, where we kind of combine the benefits of these two methods. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take the components that we got from the ECOG data. We're going to measure their time average response, because that's what we get from fMRI. So for every component, we're going to get this 165-dimensional vector on the right here. And we're just going to regress them against the response at every box. And that gives us a new weight map from the fMRI data. And so this is that weight map for the song selected component. This orange region is primary auditory cortex. And if we then overlay the weights that we get directly from the intracranial or ECOG data, we see that in places where we have shared coverage, we see a reasonably high match. So the correlation on average between the fMRI weights and the ECOG weights is fairly high relative to the upper bound given by the across subject reliability of these two modalities. So, and in particular, and we see that the across subject reliability of these modalities is way higher for fMRI because we have such better coverage. So this suggests that we can use fMRI to get a better, more reliable, and much broader and much denser spatial map of each component. And if we now look at the spatial map of the song selected component, we see that it looks like it's roughly in between speech and music selectivity. So it's clearly non-primary. And like speech selected areas, it has a hotspot lateral. And kind of like music select areas, it has a hotspot interior, though it's not quite as interior as the music select region. Okay, so a natural question is why we didn't observe this thing with fMRI. And we think that the reason is just that the ECOG data is more precise. And one simple way to test that is that if ECOG data is more precise, there should be an asymmetry where we can, for example, predict the fMRI data from the ECOG, but not vice versa. And that turns out to be the case. So here I'm showing you, this shows up, I'm showing you the, on the y-axis, this is the fMRI response of the speech and music selective components that I showed here. And on the x-axis is the prediction, just via regression from the ECOG components. And you can see that the prediction is extremely precise. We can predict about 95% of the response variance in the speech and music selective components using the time average ECOG data, even though these are from completely non-overlapping sets of subjects. And we can even predict kind of fine within category variation, the particular music sounds that produce higher responses, we can predict from the.
Is there any way you can think of joint training?
Yes, that's a very, yeah, we should totally do that. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah, we're trying to do stuff like that now. Yeah.
But just to make sure the ECOG component is now summing over multiple electrodes. So it's
the ECOG component. Yeah, well, you can, yeah, the ECOG component, you can think of, it's not quite this, but you can think of it as a kind of spatial filter applied to the electrodes in some sense.
So the spatial specificity is not preserving. Like,
well, we have for the ECOG data, we have a response component and then a set of weights for every component, a corresponding set of weights. We can look at the spatial anatomy. So, I mean, this is a the circles here are the electrodes, and the darkness reflects the weight of the song component. So we do get some anatomical distribution. Now, if you look though at how reliable this pattern is across subjects, it's like not that reliable. Just because we don't have that much coverage and we don't have that many subjects. So if you ran a new experiment, these would probably be in slightly different positions. While the fMRI data, a split half across subjects is super reliable. That's really what the map looks like. Okay, right. And if you then if you play the reverse game, if you try to predict the song select component from the fMRI components, it doesn't work at all. Song selectivity doesn't press it. Okay, so in this first part of the talk, I described a method for inferring functional organization in a more data-driven fashion. And using this method, we've been able to figure out some of the dominant response dimensions that organize the auditory cortex. In particular, we think that these non-primary regions, a really dominant aspect, maybe the main aspect of functional organization, is the selectivity for different categories, in particular music, speech, and singing. Okay, so I think I'm only going to get to the second part of the talk, which is totally fine. So in this part of the talk, I'm going to talk about some new work, looking at this question of how the brain codes information in a way that is invariant to acoustic variation. So as I noted at the beginning of the talk, and I should say this is my first time talking about this stuff. I'm excited about this work. We're writing it up now. If you have thoughts, comments, things that could improve it, things that were unclear, tell me. And we can use that to improve future talks and papers. Right. So one of the really fundamental challenges of hearing is that sounds are extraordinarily variable. So even if you listen to exactly the same speech sound, the acoustics of that speech sound can differ enormously, even if the kind of information present in the speech signal is effectively unchanged. That can be due to differences in spectral variation. For example, talking on the phone, the spectrum of the sound that you're listening to is going to be totally different. It can be due to the acoustics of the room. It can be due to the presence of background sounds. All kinds of things can acoustically change the sound that you're listening to. And so somehow the auditory system must represent information in a way that is invariant to this type of acoustic variation. This problem of invariance has been studied for a very long time in the visual system, and there's been a lot of kind of classic work on this area, but it's been less studied in the auditory cortex. And a lot of the research on the auditory cortex has focused on adaptation. So here's a nice study by Nima published a few years ago. And there's been a lot of kind of similar work in animal models done by Shihab and some other people. That shows that when there's kind of a change in the statistics of sound, so when you go from one type of background sound to another, there's a big transient in the auditory cortex that then adapts out, kind of suggesting that your brain may be kind of modeling the statistics of the signal and then kind of maybe suppressing that as a way to enhance things that are non-stationary, things that are changing. And because speech is a non-stationary signal, this is one potential mechanism that the auditory cortex might use to enhance representations of things like speech. And it's worth noting, this mechanism is not necessarily a speech-specific mechanism. It's kind of a general purpose mechanism that might be used to enhance the representation of non-stationary sounds like speech and music. We also know, of course, though, that, or not of course, but I just showed you evidence that the brain also has mechanisms that are very specific to speech and music. And you can imagine that some of these speech and music-specific mechanisms might be important to invariant information coding in the auditory cortex. And we currently don't have a great understanding of exactly which mechanisms contribute to invariant coding because people, for the most part, haven't looked at it very much. And a lot of the work has used kind of coarser methods like fMRI. So this is a prior paper from my friend Alex Kell, who ran an fMRI study using a very similar kind of set of sounds that I described before, kind of diverse set of natural sounds. And he measured the strength of invariance in the auditory cortex when he presented different kinds of background sounds. And he found that the more non-primary regions were more invariant. And this is an important and cool study, but the main limitation is that he's basically missing all of the interesting stuff because he's measuring fMRI. So, if he presents like a 2-second sentence, what he measures from that sentence is one number, the average response to that sentence. So most of the interesting variation, say within the domain of speech that differentiates phonemes or syllables, is not going to be represented in this kind of data. Okay, so we're going to take a whack at answering this question using intracranial recordings. This is the work of my postdoc, Dan Bobinger, who's awesome. The intracranial recordings, most of them are from the University of Rochester, and we're actively collaborating with the neurosurgical and neurology team there, who's been totally awesome to work with. And also some of the data that's coming from Iowa, who we have a new grant with. And some of you guys may know Kirill or Natalie. So the intracranial recordings from this study are coming from a depth electrode. So I showed you those grids, right, where they kind of have coverage of the surface of the brain. For the most part, with a few exceptions, the intracranial monitoring that's done for epilepsy has switched from using these grids, which are much harder on the patient, to these depth electrodes where you have a small burr hole and the electrodes inserted perpendicular to the skull. It kind of looks more invasive, but it's much easier on the patient. And from the research perspective, these have different pros and cons. Typically, the coverage is a little worse, but we get coverage of all of the auditory cortex. So with these electrodes, we actually get coverage of primary areas that you normally don't see with grids. Which is going to be useful for answering something.
The epileptic areas are sort of close to the auditory cortex.
The epileptic areas most commonly are in the immediate temporal lobe. So they're often going through the auditory cortex to get to the epileptic zones. Epilepsy occurs everywhere in the brain, but the hotspot is mesotemporal lobe. So they're almost always targeting hippocampus, amygdala, those kind of zones.
Are there visual studies which also use the CCOC?
Absolutely. They're rarer. You see more auditory stuff, and there's a good reason for that. Which is that the coverage, you get way more auditory coverage just because you have to kind of go through the auditory cortex to get to these mesotemporal structures. Okay, so what we're going to do in this study is we're going to present a speech with and without various kinds of acoustic variation that I've already described to you. And we're then going to perform the following very complicated analysis. I apologize for this awful slide that I'm just throwing up there, but we're going to go through it slowly and explain everything. Do you have a question?
Lines over.
Yeah, I should have animated this, but I didn't have time for that. So, okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to present sentences. So each of these, this is just waveforms of different sentences of speech. And we're then going to measure the neural response time course of each electrode to the different sentences. That's what the black line is. There's also, we're going to highlight these boundaries just correspond to word boundaries. This is the onset and offset of a particular word. We're then going to present those exact same sentences with different types of variation. So these colors just represent different types of variation. It could be adding reverberation. It could be adding like a low pass filter. It could be adding background noise, just a wide variety of different types of variation. And then this is the critical part. This is what's going to allow us to compute a dynamic measure of invariance. We're going to present those same words without variation in a random sequence. Okay. So you can see that we have, as a consequence of this, we have the same word present that we had before, but now it's surrounded by different stuff. Okay. And what we're then going to do is we're going to, for a given lag relative to the onset of a word, we're going to pick out the response at that lag for each of the different words. And we're going to do that both with variation and without variation in the random word sequence. Okay. And we're then going to correlate those two vectors. And so that's going to produce a curve that's like this red line here. So it's going to be close to 0 before the onset of the shared word, because prior to the onset of the shared word, what came before it is totally random between these two cases. As we move forward in time, if there's an invariant representation of the word that is shared between the clean and the variation case, then we will observe a significant correlation. The red curve will go up. Now, that red curve is just in arbitrary units. It's just correlation coefficient. So it's not really meaningful on its own. But in order to compute a ceiling for that invariant correlation, we can compute exactly the same measure, but without any variation in it, right? That provides the maximum possible response. So if the response is totally invariant, what will happen is the red curve will equal the blue curve. And so as an extra visualization tool, I'm also going to compute the difference between the blue and the red curve, and that's the purple curve. We call the non-invariant correlation. So if the response is non-invariant, i.e. it totally changes when you add acoustic variation, then the purple curve will equal the blue curve, and the red curve will be 0. Does that make sense? Most complicated slide in the whole talk.
So I'm a bit confused. So on one side you have the variation, and on one side you have different context.
Yes, I'm kind of doubling down on status. Yeah, mixing these two.
Why like that?
Okay.
Thanks for letting me.
Okay. There's a simpler way to do this, and some of the results you can see with a simpler method. What's nice about this method is it provides a dynamic measure of invariance relative to the onset of like shared information, which I'll show you produces some interesting results. We can see that the strength of invariance varies over time, and we can map that out with this paradigm. That's the whole reason for doing this. If you want to just measure like the overall invariance, you can do something very simple. You can correlate this and this. That's a simple. And we've done that. It produces kind of similar, qualitatively similar results, but we lose this interesting dynamics. This provides a way of measuring the strength of invariance and how that changes over time.
And these are isolated words or continuous speech?
This sentence is just continuous. These are sentences, so continuous speeches. And
So these words. So when you cut them, when you change the context. So how do you do that? Because
we just chop them up into words. And then we reorder them, and we crossfade between the words.
Does it sound natural?
It sounds like a random word sequence. Which is, I could play them for you.
Articulation or stuff. So it wouldn't be like smooth, but you can't really cut the word out of the sentence and then you put in another word.
Yeah. It's a consequence. We're going to screw up certain core articulation stuff that occurs between words. Absolutely.
And they have an effect in whatever result you read. Sure.
Well, let me show you the results, and then I'll tell you. I think the answer is no, but it's easier to see the results and then speculate about how that might affect things. But yeah, absolutely, this is a much less natural condition, and we're doing it for this particular reason that we want to be able to measure the buildup of invariance over time. And we chose words intentionally because we think that might be a meaningful unit of analysis. So yeah, it's sort of maybe
Altogether on we must quite. When you use the same third column there, you also used it in your study of Windows.
Yeah.
Sort of suggesting what people need here is also affected by integration of sides.
Yes.
A bit uncomfortable because that's
It implies that this it's in data. I feel like once we get results in data, we can discuss whether the results in data could be biased by this kind of thing. Right. Totally. I mean, what actually happened here is that econ data is super precious. I try to like take as many studies and put them into one study as humanly possible so that we can ask lots of different questions with the same data. And so this study is actually like a subset of like a bigger study where we're trying to do lots of different things at once. Yeah. Okay, here's some data. So here's an electrode in a very primary region. And the blue curve, that's the ceiling, and the red curve is the invariance curve. You can see the red curve is low and the purple curve is high. This is a very non-invariant response, right? The response changes a lot when we add variation. Here's another electrode, also in a kind of primary region. This is a lot of electrodes look like this, which is that they show kind of partial invariance, right? So you can see the red curve is about halfway up. The blue curve and the red curve and purple curve are about equal. Here's another electrode that shows really striking invariance. So you can see that the red curve is almost identical to the blue curve, and it's equal to the blue curve basically as soon as it could possibly be, suggesting that this electrode is basically totally invariant to acoustic variation. And here's a fourth electrode. This is, I think, the most interesting electrode for me. This is an electrode that is basically totally invariant to acoustic variation, but it takes some time to develop. So you can see initially, the red curve is below the blue curve, right? And the purple curve is about equal. And then after some period, the response becomes totally invariant after about 200 milliseconds. So this tells you that the invariant representations are fast. It takes about 200 milliseconds for this response to become totally invariant to acoustic information, but it takes longer than for non-invariant processing. So it's very suggestive of kind of there's two stages of processing. There's an initial stage of processing that is more acoustically sensitive, and then a subsequent stage of processing that is more invariant. To me, it kind of is suggestive of some kind of recurrent computation where relative to the information present in the signal, the response in some sense becomes more complex over time.
This was for clean speech.
No, this is looking at the comparison between clean and acoustically variable speech.
But the type of variability is because you say short 4 or 5.
I'll show you some results where we break it down. It's variation. Yeah.
So the words might have different lengths.
They do. They have different lengths.
But the correlation after the variance that I can assume that the word is small in one context and bigger in later context. So how do you compensate for the fact?
Dana, we still have the results, and Dana's going to do some analysis where she breaks it down by word duration. I don't think the effects are going to change very much. And I agree, it's like, it maybe makes it a little harder to think about that the word variations are changing. But I mean, again, the ceiling correlation is the acid test, right? That everything's the same between the ceiling correlation and the invariant correlation. All of the word variation, again, it's all the same. So if the response is invariant, the red curve should equal the blue curve, and it does. So, maybe getting back to some of these concerns. So I had this concern that we wouldn't really see strong invariance in the presence of like random word patterns because it was less natural. But of course, we see super striking invariance, and it's hard to imagine how making things less natural would produce a more invariant representation.
Yeah, it's just surprising because I just thought of the new compound.
Oh, what's the confound?
So when you gradually replace a word, the semantic surprisal for other response also would be much more for that compared to.
Totally, yeah. How does that affect your interpretation of this?
Well, so another source, no, it's this, it goes against it. So you should see more variation.
Yeah, totally.
I went 400.
Totally. I mean, well, there might be an N400 response, but the point is that N400 response is totally invariant to acoustics, right?
Yes, but can you separate that here?
I mean, this is intentionally blind to the type of what's being coded. This is just saying whatever's being coded could be a zillion things. That representation of that speech structure is complete for this electrode is completely invariant to acoustic variation. The particular type of acoustic variation.
And it's also not sensitive to semantics, right? Otherwise, you would see it constantly.
Well, you could see an N400 response, right? So there could be a well, no, you're right. It's because I think it's well, I guess this probably is not very sensitive to the N400 because the point is if you saw an N400, that wouldn't correlate between these two conditions. So yeah, no, I think it's basically should be pretty insensitive to the N400. Yeah, I agree with that. Which I don't think is a confound, but it's something that is, I guess, an aspect of neural coding that is not going to be present in the data.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the hypotheses we had is that speech selectivity might be important, right? So maybe speech selective regions are important for the representation of invariant coding. So to look at that, we're going to do a very simple analysis where we select a subset of electrodes that are speech selective. So this just shows you the raster plot for these electrodes, and they respond more to speech than to other stuff. And we have a control set of electrodes that are not speech selective. And we're then going to just average these curves within these two ROIs, regions of interest. And so what you see is that the speech selective electrodes are extremely invariant. So after about 200 milliseconds, the response becomes almost completely invariant to acoustic variation, and that invariance is much stronger than what we see for the non-selective electrodes. We also interestingly see this kind of evidence of this interesting dynamics. So it takes a little bit of time, right, for that invariance to emerge. Suggestive again of this kind of dynamic process. And again, this is not relative to the onset of sound, right? It's not relative to the onset of the type of variation. This is relative to the onset of speech information. So it's as though your neurons are kind of chomping on the speech. And as they chomp on the speech, the kind of further from that, when that information was present, the more invariant that representation becomes. Again, kind of suggestive of something like an RNN, where the response becomes more nonlinear, more complex over time, relative to the onset of information.
Stupid question, Pat. You think that invariance is due to the word?
We have no idea what aspect of speech is driving the invariance. We are intentionally being somewhat agnostic to that. We're saying whatever the representation of speech is, we're trying to quantify how sensitive it is to acoustic variation. So we explicitly, in this particular, we're doing other experiments to look at this. In this particular experiment, we intentionally chose types of variation that did not really change the speech content, right? So if you add background noise, the information in the speech signal sort of, in some sense, not changing. When you add reverberation, you know, the signal is getting smoothed out, but again, the kind of, in some sense, the speech content is preserved. Okay. The other thing that's kind of striking is that these speech selective electrodes, they're invariant to all of these types of variation. So this is spectral filtering, pretty dramatic spectral filtering, where they're applying like a pretty dramatic low pass filter or a band pass filter or a high pass filter. We're adding substantial background noise or reverberation, substantial reverberation. In all cases, we see that after about 200 milliseconds, the response is basically totally invariant to variation.
Should we have noise about any condition?
You know, in the case of the random words, it's definitely less intelligible, I would say. So, okay, so one important and interesting aspect that I'm surprised by is in most conditions, we intentionally added the variation to the sentences because we expected there to be some interaction where if you add the variation to the random words, it's going to hurt you more. And we wanted to give ourselves the best chance of seeing more naturalistic type of invariance. Now we have one condition where we swap things, and it doesn't seem like that matters that much. It's not like if you put the variation with the random words, it doesn't hurt you a lot compared to putting you with the more naturalistic things. And I would say, certainly for the sentences, yeah, they're intelligible. I should pick and play that tree. We tried to pick a level that was basically about as much as you could add while still making the thing pretty intelligible.
Do you think there is a possibility that the variance in the first 200 milliseconds is driven by the fact that we're still trying to maybe identify the sound class?
Well, the sound class is not, well, you mean like, so they're all like
The sound types.
well, it's all speech. Do you mean? This is not like before where we had lots of different types of sounds. Here it's just speech. So it's just a random sequence of words basically in one condition. In the other case, it's just sentences.
But then on top down, we're still, before hearing that, we don't know that. So like,
No, you know it's speech. You totally know it's speech. Maybe for the very first word, but this is averaging across a gazillion words of the whole experiment.
yeah, but the first 200 most.
Of the first word. But like there's like 400 words, right? Yeah. I don't think, but I do think you do see some evidence of this kind of like, this is related to the onset of sound, but you do sometimes see that speech selectivity gets greater over time, right? So you can see that here, so that kind of thing you do see reflected in the neural signal, but it's kind of something else.
Sorry.
Okay, if you look back at these electrodes, there's an anatomical confound, maybe if you want to think about it that way, where the speech selective electrodes, they're more non-primary. They're further from primary to cortex. So this effect that I'm showing you might be a hierarchy effect rather than a speech selectivity effect. So to try to control for that, we have an analysis where we match the distance. So on average, the speech selective electrodes, they're more distant from primary to cortex than the non-selective electrodes. But we can subsample the non-selective electrodes to match the distance. When we do that, we still see a difference between the two conditions. It does seem like maybe the matching does increase the invariance a little bit, so maybe there is some small effect of hierarchy as well. But it does seem like the biggest effect is the effect of speech activity, which goes way up. I got 2 minutes. All right, I'm just going to show you one more house and I'm going to stop. This goes for an hour, right? At 11:30, is that right? Okay. So this is one more analysis where we tried to look at effects of adaptation. So in our analysis, we have the acoustic variation is changing every about 4 seconds. So what we can do is we can select words and we can bin the words based on how far they were from the change in variation, right? Because the type of variation is changing. And so, if there was, if the adaptation to the type of variation were really important, you might expect less invariance here, right after a change, compared with here, when you've had some time to adapt to the change. So we kind of have 2 measures. We have the time lag from the onset of the word, which is what I've been talking about so far. And then we have the time lag from the variation onset, which is now a new dimension that I'm describing. So we get from this, we now get an image. We have 2 dimensions. We have the time from word onset and the time from variation onset. We average across this axis. We get a plot like this, which just shows the invariance, in this case, between speech selective and non-selective electrodes as a function of the time from variation onset. And so what you see is that, I wish we had a little more resolution down here, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot of change in the degree of invariance. Basically, you're invariant pretty fast. These strong invariant representations are present kind of as soon as we can measure them after the onset of variation, suggesting that they don't require kind of an extended adaptation period to produce them.
Isn't that surprising? That goes against model literature.
Yeah, I would say it suggests that it's not that for kind of these, at least for these speech selective regions, they don't really require that kind of extended adaptation period. That there's some other mechanism that is maybe tuned to speech specific structure that doesn't require this super fast thing. There almost is certainly, the effects that you showed in your paper, they're really big, right? So they must be present, and they're almost certainly contributing to coding in some way. But they seem, at least in our hands, to not have a big effect on the strength of invariance, at least measured in this way.
But you want to check with the HCA. There's an ERP, the moment of change.
Yeah, we do. We see that. And we don't see, even there, we don't see a huge change in the invariance, which is, I found a little public. We could talk about it. I'd be interested in getting your feedback on that, actually. And maybe if you could think of something else we could do to address that, that would be cool. Yeah, I kind of expected to see some effects here, and I was surprised at how little of an effect we saw here. So, like I said, I wish we're running some more studies where I want to zoom in on this time period. So maybe if we zoom in, we'll see a little bit of something there. But it is, this is pretty, it's pretty compelling, right? It's like as fast as we can measure it, things are very slow. Okay, and we're at time, so I'll just end. Pause for colleagues. And thanks. Any other? Yeah, I'm particularly interested in thoughts on this new stuff. Cool. All clear? You believe it?
Thank you very much.
Todos que para plans mas meetings would be already with my thing that was here over on a big or whole three months in others tools right symbol so to do stuff people are fixed when you get failure so right what so yeah that's the part on so it's right you find a lot on top for the sex effects if you would start on being processed
Raise good. But also make sure to see things from your perspective, right? How can this help you? And ask critical questions if you don't see how this benefits you, because that's really the point. We still live it by the community for the community. Yes. The subtitle of this talk is to enable interoperability between the neuromorphic software and hardware platforms from a painful number of different academic and research groups. So to start with that, we can go through some very brief history of selected frameworks. So Brian has been around for a long time. We can use that to simulate neuron dynamics. Lengo has been around for a long time. You can do tons of things with this, including putting stuff on hardware and working with parsing architectures and vector symbolic architectures and Spawn and what have you. Lava is around because now you can use that to port James Wiki. SNN Torch is around because this guy out in Australia decided yet another SNN library was needed. Norse is around because some guys in Europe decided yet another neuron library was needed. Synapse is around because some hardware guys decided we don't want to use other libraries, we want to build our own libraries, our own hardware. And Rockpool is around because some other guys in the same company decided we want to make another library for our own hardware. Spix is around because, of course, PyTorch is being deprecated because everyone is moving to JAX. And Spike and Gully is around because, of course, nobody cares about Python. We provide all our kernels in custom CUDA code so that nobody can collaborate with us. And, of course, new libraries come up who doesn't even have the GitHub page study because everything is just a giant mess. Neuron is another simulator. Einstein also exists if you want to be more biologically possible, even though that doesn't really exist. Slax is now no way to compose different JAX libraries for spiking neural networks. And all of this is just extremely painful, right? I mean, nobody in their right mind can orient this landscape and be productive at the same time. It's a disaster.
Which one is the best?
Near is the except the best library is the one that you write. Exactly. Now, just to make it worse. Okay. So, of course, apart from the fact that we want to, have a lot of funding to develop all these things, we're kind of kidding because all these serve a bit of a purpose. And I think it's fair to say that all of these libraries are not developed because people are enjoying pain. They're developed because they have a specific purpose, like a specific chip. And it's been very, very difficult to converge the field because there are so many different ways to work with these different networks. We do think it benefits the community to talk a bit about together. So last year, we had a lot of fun. There was a lot of snow compared to what we ordered last year, but we met up and discussed. So here is Felix, Pang, Gregor, Steve will be here in a few days, and myself discussing about how could we make this less painful in general. And the work we've done here is really a continuation of all this. And so we started thinking about how can we make this a bit more common? Can we speak the same language? Can we use some of the same symbols across all of these different platforms? That's really what we want to talk to you about today. We want to tell you about what NIR is and why we think you should really care about this. Then we want to tell you that it's not just, some brainchild, freak fantasy of ours. It actually works, and we have simulation to demo it, and we can put stuff on hardware, which Gregor is going to do for us on this Sense spec chips. We also wanted to do Spinnaker 2, but unfortunately, it seems like COVID is slowly proliferating around the crowd here. And finally, we want to present to you, if you basically have a tool chain or some platform that you can imagine could benefit from this ecosystem. So we want to give you with some ideas on how you can make that happen very practically. So how can you make it near compatible for Facebook? And yeah, Jason might jump up and talk about. Oh, what's up? I hope. Listen. But let's talk about introduction. Yeah, so in the paper, we talk a bit about this plethora of different platforms. So as you know, there are many of these libraries that do an excellent job. Most of them just work in discrete time. That's great for digital discrete hardware, but you also have to be sensitive to the fact that there are other platforms coming. So if you look to discrete time, digital hardware, those things really exist and they're great. But there are also other platforms working in more or less continuous time, right? So Silo would be asynchronous, for instance. No, it wouldn't. Sorry. Silo would be continuous time in some sense. Spinnaker 2, you can consider continuous time because you have asynchronous communication. There are other platforms that resemble more or less continuous time, not fitness. Okay. And finally, of course, the holy grail, as we established yesterday, is to get an end-to-end neuromorphic pipeline where we don't even have to think about digital hardware. We can implement everything in analog. we grade this out because this is not something we deal with in the paper. It would be great to have one day, but that's future work.
It is what's interesting is that we're being very liberal in our definition of continuous time here. So Lowy, for example, I think the rest of them do still work with some delta t, but we're just leaving it as continuous time because they can be asynchronously processed. I think Lowy doesn't really have that. It's got deterministic processing, so it's not really continuous time in the classical definition of it, but I think Spinnaker can be. So yeah, just kind of that asterisk. Okay.
And it's really hard to classify this stuff, I have to say, without also making people angry. But let's ask questions if anything. So of course, ideally, we want to go to this frontier of hardware. So the question we ask, like, how do we then port these very, very heterogeneous, time-varying systems? And one inspiration, of course, is to look at the deep learning field. More or less solve this, right? So there's a wonderful paper called The Hardware Lottery that basically talks about how deep learning works because the hardware works. It's not the other way around. And the reason why this is a particular inspiration is because it's been around for a couple of decades and they've done a tremendously good job in unifying them. But everybody pretty knows what the two-dimensional convolution is. It just works across the different platforms. So those tools kind of exist. You have this interoperability. And the takeaway here is that you have this common understanding of what a convolution is that, maps end-to-end or end-to-end frameworks. You don't have to map from Caffe directly to NX and from Caffe to PyTorch and so on and so forth. You can squish everything in the middle, and then from this representation, everyone knows what they're talking about. Okay, I get it. It's a convolution. And this does not exist for spiking neural networks, right? So we have all these libraries, but it's very difficult to crosstalk. So Nengo has done a great job on mapping to a lot of different hardware, right? But obviously, if you're JSON, that's kind of useless because that doesn't work for SNN torch. So what do? Well, you don't do anything. You just have to write your own stack. And then we have yet another standard that we have to deal with. So that's the problem we're trying to solve. And just to give you a brief overview, I think I'm going to gloss over this very quickly, but in the conventional literature, you can think about this open neural network exchange format as a primitive for signals in discrete times. MLIR is also discrete, so you can do multi-level intermediate representations with discrete executions. That's great, except it's not continuous. TVM has a similar functionality to compile some of these networks across different platforms. NeuroML is arguably something that's closer to continuous time. They represent this huge XML graphs, and LEMS is then one reference simulation of it. We chose to not go that path because it's a fairly cumbersome representation, but it's not entirely different. For neuromorphic systems, you're probably familiar with Pine as a way to work with SNN networks. I think brain scales, the Spinnaker has been integrating with that. Unfortunately, it's not entirely platform independent. You need to instruct specific hardware strings for brain scales in Spinnaker. But the way you normally can go about this, for instance, is that you sit in Brian and you realize, okay, Brian, I can convert something into Pine. So there's a handshake going on that, well, Brian, agrees with Pine on how to represent these models. And then in turn, Pine will then convert that into something that Spinnaker will understand. There's kind of a multi-hop here, which is the same hop that we saw before between, for instance, Caffe and PyTorch. And this is really the handshake protocol that's necessary because this is where we can condense the representation. Like I said, unfortunately, Pine is not the end-all be-all, so other people have tried to do this, Nengo, LavaDL. QUBO is an interesting idea where you can combine and compose different higher order primitives. I'm not going to go into detail with this, but it's a very, very cool initiative. So the problem here is that they operate at a neuron model and synapse model level abstractions, and the handshakes become a little more involved because they can be platform specific. It's not when I am Brian that shakes hands with Pine, I still need to describe some of the network dynamics in that handshake, depending on the hardware platform I'm targeting. I'm not completely independent of the hardware. I don't have a representation which is completely detached from the way that we work with the hardware. And so for this to work, we have to make these handshakes agnostic. We have to make sure that when you go from A to B to C, the representations are the same as if I went from A to B to D, for instance.
Yeah, that's slightly more difficult in neuromorphic context, but because there isn't an embed here who has CUDA, which is the easier platform to put everything onto. Because most of that is kind of just CUDA centric, because if you try and use like OGL and stuff like that, everything becomes much more difficult again. Because that can have manifestation of being hardware already being somewhat known.
Yeah.
They say complete, but obviously not.
That's a very good point. And so I have two comments to that. One thing is that we're not solving all the problems, right? NIR is not actually running stuff in your hardware. We're just representing. You think about it as a C++ standard or something, right? And of course, for CUDA, you need to write specific C++ to make it work. But another point is that I think that's why we can be relatively proud of what we've done, because it actually works depending on the different platforms. There are some caveats I'm going to come back to. It's not an end-all be-all solution, but and maybe I should add a final point to this, right? Because CUDA is a great reason why we have to do something like this. Because if one company goes up and develops CUDA, that's great when you work in NVIDIA, right? But if you have other chips, you're lost, right? That's going to water like
development chips here, we're all part of that company.
Yeah, that's the reason all by sharing everyone. So how do you solve this? Well, our reasoning is that we're not inspired by specific instructions in CUDA or in SimSense or whatever else. We want to go back to the principles, the fundamental. And the first principle here is physics. Like we want to work with analog systems eventually, and they're not represented by discrete instruction. They're represented as time-evolving systems. That is our primitive. We're not trying to build instructions in a digital sense. We're building instructions in the physical sense. And so this is how it looks like. We are not describing a graph of discrete instructions. We're describing a graph of continuous time instructions, but it is the same thing. It is still a graph representation, like you would have an abstract syntax tree or some kind of sequence instructions in a conventional computer. NIR programs are literally just nodes, like a leak integrator on thresholding function or linearity, that you then connect in different ways. I'll come back to more specific examples. And the way that then NIR works is that we have to represent that somehow in a way that's specific to given platforms, right? So we decompose this and mean, okay, how can we work with these very abstract, annoying mathematical idealized representations? Well, we have to figure out how we want to operationalize it. And of course, one way that you're very familiar with is just to discretize it. So we say, okay, we have some kind of explicit Euler, and then each time step, we just go through it, and that's going to give us an approximate solution. It's not going to be great, but it's going to be reasonable. But we could also imagine that we retain these dynamical systems and keep working with them. The reason why this is important that we divide it here is because the hardware platforms require this kind of decomposition. Because if I am, for instance, in a digital piece of hardware, I cannot run continuous time representations. Right? I need this temporal discretization. So the distinction here on the left, where we actually execute the graphs, are based on simulation, where we can, represent, we can play that we are in the hardware, or in the hardware, where we then actually have the continuous representations, like in, brain scales or in a T1 chip, what have you, or the digital hardware, like some of the modern platforms here, which still has this instruction-based digital representation. And so the genius, I think, here is that we can actually bridge all of these things. If you're familiar with any of these platforms, you will know this will not be perfect. I'll tell you why not in a minute, but it actually gets pretty darn close, which I find very cool. So NIR is literally just a standard that lets us interface these neural physical descriptions. So we're not notice in this one, we're not claiming to execute anything. NIR is literally just happening here. it's the individual platform that needs to do this decomposition. Right? You have to decide, are you continuous time or discrete platform? Once you've done that, you have to figure out, okay, how do you want to discretize this? You want to use Euler or Putzer? How do you want to work with this? But the idea of bringing this near into the picture is for the community to have a similar language. And the reason why that's cool is because then all of these commercial and exotic hardware platforms will have done this work for you. So as long as you can model your problem in this representation, ideally it's as simple as just tossing your graph to that tech stack and then washing your hands and going about your PhD. That would be nice. And I think Jason liked to phrase it like this, like we wrote thousands of lines of code so that you can only write one. Because here you can just, many of these platforms offer support for NIR, which means you can directly go from the model into the documentation and then you're done. Question?
No, sorry.
Yeah, yes. That sounds extremely exciting. I guess you had some hardware you're simulating and you wanted to sort of make contact with these other hardwares or other simulators that are optimized that would be very convenient. I'm just wondering if there's some sort of like, I don't know, limiting factor complexity-wise, like what if you have an unusual hardware, dendrites or extra operations and things like that? So do you have to, for this lingua franca thing, like fit into a specific box that is agreed upon for all of these things?
Right.
Or can you maybe negotiate additional handshake on top? Like how's that dealt with?
Yeah. So you're asking whether you have like specific behavior on a specific hardware platform. So the downside of this approach, right, is that if you, like when you do this funnel approach, where you basically compress your representation into this layer, if the dynamics you want to describe is not represented here, you're out of luck.
Okay, that's what I was asking.
So then you need to either add that primitive into this representation, or do something else entirely. I want to come back to your question later to discuss platform-specific optimizations, because even though you have these primitives, they're going to work differently in different platforms. So I'm going to talk about platform-aware training in it.
And I think it is mentioning that what we chose to do was just like a first-order ODE low-pass filter. That seems to be like close dynamic represented in neuromorphic hardware, but also given the composability of, I guess, any one of these representations or in exchange formats. It's not just a matter of having continuous time dynamic node with an edge, which might be a weight, another continuous time dynamic node, another which is just two layers of integrated via neurons. You can also stack the dynamic with another dynamic to chain that together to form like a second order filter. But of course, there are going to be more complex dynamics out there. Physics is infinite. There is no possible way we can capture them all. So figuring out how to scale that is very much a question. I think that as we see hardware that does exploit alternative dynamics, that it can be a matter of, all right, let's represent it. It makes sense. Personal opinion, I think that's probably going to come from state space literature, because that is to be used.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that a bit later, I think, but good question. So just to give you a great example, we wanted to show you Spinnaker 2, for instance, which we're not going to do here practically, but we have tutorials and code that shows you how you can take graphs and put it into Luigi, Spinnaker 2, Spec, Silo, so concrete hardware platforms. Spec we're going to show you later. And I'm pretty happy about this because I'm using that as my daily driver, because I mean I can communicate between these platforms. I couldn't do that before. So the question now becomes, what is it and how does it work? Like, why can we get that effect, basically? And to come back to this near graph, like we have this continuous representation, and I think it's fair for you to say, if you're familiar with any kind of dynamic systems, that it's going to be imprecise when we go into discrete time, right? We simply cannot model this perfectly in discrete executions. That's just how it is. So Jennifer is applauding. I appreciate that. I mean, I think that's an often overlooked fact, right?
It's triple fact.
Sorry?
It's a triple fact.
A what?
It's triple.
It's a probable fact.
Yes.
I appreciate that. So it feels good to be backed up, but that's one of the cruxes of neuromorphics, right? We have to deal with that discrepancy, and we have to deal with the fact that even though that's provable, many platforms are still digital. So to give you a look under the hood, near graphs are actually very, very simple, just like computational graphs are very, very simple. And again, recall we're not implementing anything. We're essentially just building symbolic networks, right? A bit like, a symbolic pointer, if you will. So we just have a set of nodes that describes these boxes. And then we have a set of edges that describe the connectivity between these boxes. And there are no constrictions or restraints in this graph. If you want to get an infinite number of edges recurring to the same node, we don't advise that, but you can do it. You can have multiple edges going in and out of nodes. You can do whatever you want. NIR is very unopinionated, similar to the dynamics, but we don't care what you model because we don't have the responsibility of running these things. It's going to be your problem later that if you define a really complicated graph, it has to be converted into some kind of executable format, right? So there's a bit of a trade-off. There has to be some negotiation between what you want to represent computationally and what you want to have physically in your marshal running. But that's really it. That is what NIR is. There's no more magic to it. It's a very simple set of nodes and then connections between the nodes. So the connections don't do anything. They're identity transforms, if you will. They're literally just saying, take the output of this and put it into this. And so when you have that graph, you have a declaration of your computation, if you will. But of course, the value only comes to fruition when you can do something with that declaration. So here's one example where you can take one model from the simulator Norse, and this can be anything. In our case, it's a very boring sequential model. And if I want to run this, for instance, on Synapse spec later, I have to, instead of going from Norse directly to Spinnaker, I can say, okay, I can represent my graph in Norse in NIR. And because both Norse and spec understand NIR, I have a perfect way to communicate with your platforms. So second, I just take that graph I just created with Norse and I import it. The end. So actually, our hope is not to, we don't expect to solve all problems here, right? But actually, our hope is that the users will not even have to know what NIR is. It's just going to be a glue between the different simulators. Ideally, at some point when the IPS develop and so on and so forth, you can just directly go from Norse to Synapse via NIR, but implicitly so the user don't have to care about it. So it's just a translation there. Yeah, is that clear? Awesome. So this is really, if there's a take-home message, then this is it. Just use NIR as a Python object. End. Done. There's a bit more detail to it because we've talked about what happens if you have specific features on chips and what if you then have a digital platform that cannot do these continuous time integrations. And of course, we run into troubles. So what we did in our paper is that we ran similar experiments across all the different hardware platforms. And one experiment that almost all platforms implement is the NIC integrator and Fire model, by the way. But here we have a dynamical system, and the question that is, how does that work? And you can see that all the platforms here are given the same input spike, and they have roughly the same membrane evolution here. Not entirely. So this is a spiking pattern. You see some of the platforms spike at different times because they're a different way to integrate these things. And that's one awareness we have to deal with. We're not going to get perfect reproducibility across all the platforms. And we did another example with convolutional neural networks. And what you see here is a cosine similarity for the activation across time in the first layer of this spiking convolutional neural network. So we're taking a very high dimensional vector and taking the cosine similarity measure. So all of them are actually surprisingly close to each other because such a huge vector. But you can see there are some problematics, right? So for instance, if you connect Synapse to Spinnaker 2, you have a bit of a mismatch, right? There's discrepancy. So back to the point before, how do we deal with that discrepancy? Well, instead of trying to hide it and fix it, NIR is just directly representing the ideal computation. But each computational node here has parameters, right? Like the leak identifier will have, for instance, this leak term and resistive term and so on and so forth. And you can change that to be platform specific, right? So if I want to train a model in Ningo, I can be aware of the discretization happening in Synapse, right? So you can do platform aware training where you can circumvent these problems. It's not easy, of course, but NIR doesn't care because NIR is just the same computational graph with some parameters. Whether those parameters are fitted to work well on Synapse doesn't really matter.
It's worth mentioning that this is pretty much the best you can do because the mismatches between leaky gratifying neurons across these different packages are simply coded in different ways. So, for example, I could, if I have several lines of code, my first line could be check the membrane potential threshold. If it's greater than the threshold, fire, or it could happen at the end after you've updated. So a simple reordering is going to matter. In my case, when I brought up SNN torch, I went ahead, used order Weber to solve the first order low-pass filter equation. And I was like, all right, T-flag doesn't really care about an extra coefficient, so let's drop that. Let's just assume that's subsumed into the weight matrix of that linear layer that comes before it. So fundamentally, we have mismatches that can't be perfectly fixed, but NIR has kind of factored into what's the best you can achieve in terms of getting something similar. So going to the next slide, you can see, right, SNN torch isn't perfectly, sorry, going to this convolutional, fusion matrix. So SNN torch is it deviates from the rest of them, but it's pretty similar to, say, let's see, SNN torch, just say, SNN torch is similar to SNN torch and spec. Okay. But then the rest of them kind of more similar to one another as well.
So I'm Tobi, in case you don't know, and I'm going to give a talk about the hybrid vision sensors, which are frames plus events. And this talk is really targeted towards chip designers. So I'm going to talk about some pixel circuits and CMOS fabrication technologies and things like that. It's a little bit historical, but I'm going to end up with the latest industrial sensors that just appeared last year in ISSCC. So this is really about hybrid vision sensors that put frames plus brightness change events. By the way, this INI is like visitors. You know that, right? Probably give up into INI. Okay, I got the rate. Okay, so let me just start with this single slide of biological motivation, which is that in all biological vision systems, from insects to mammals, there's a partition between sustained and transient pathways. It's an anatomical, physiological, and functional partition and it starts in the retina with different classes of ganglion cells, and even in the thalamus, it's preserved with different layers of the thalamus, and it's even preserved in the input layer, layer 4 of V1. Functionally and anatomically differentiated between the transient pathway, which is coarsely characterized by coarse spatial resolution. It's fast and it sees gray only. And a sustained pathway, which has fine spatial resolution. It's slower, say a factor of 3 slower, but maybe a factor of 3 in spatial resolution more, higher spatial resolution, and it sees color. This is monochrome, and only the sustained pathway sees color. And this is very coarse division between classes of ganglion cells and other cells in other areas of the brain. Anyway, evolution has discovered that this is efficient. This is the way you should build vision systems. And so that's the inspiration for some of the more recent event cameras or frame event cameras, now called hybrid vision sensor. But the first one that really did frames and events was the Davis. You guys will recognize the DBS pixel that I talked about the other day, which continuously transduces into brightness change events from the photocurrent. And after Christoph Posch came up with the ADIS, the asynchronous time-based image sensor, what he had was really 2 pixels. This pixel plus another pixel right next to it with a different photodiode that would turn the time between 2 events into the grayscale. And I always thought that was a bit silly idea because of the pixel area. And so we figured out how to just take the same photocurrent flowing through this photoreceptor circuit non-destructively and just integrate it over time onto a capacitor, which you periodically reset to a fixed voltage. So you reset this voltage high here to VDD. You read the voltage because you need to read the reset level. and you read that out through a source follower, and that's done in a column parallel way. So it's all the pixels in a column or row. Let's say it's a column. All the pixels in a column have their reset level sampled, and then you let the entire sensor integrate. I say missing something. You let the sensor integrate for a certain amount of time, the integration time, and then you read the signal level. And these are read in parallel with column parallel A to D converters. Very simple readouts. Yeah. So you get frames and events that way. So you have kind of a sustained and transient pathway in the same sensor. And you share the same photodiode, which is nice because everything's perfectly registered. Now, at that time, this is part of the See Better project, which is a wonderful project that followed Caviar. We had to set up a CMOS image sensor fab because we needed to do a dedicated wafer run. And so we contacted Tower Jazz in Israel, and Shenghan and I went for a wonderful trip there to Migdal Hanik, which is close by the Sea of Galilee, just opposite the Golan Heights in Syria. And we visited Tower Jazz, and they're one of the few CMOS image sensor suppliers that'll let you do multi-project wafer runs. For $50,000, they'll let you fabricate a 5x5 millimeter chip, plus the packaging and everything, like $60K. But the dedicated wafer run cost about, I think, about $600K as part of the EU project. And so it's fair to say that much of neuromorphic vision sensors wouldn't exist without this European funding, about the tune of about $2 million. And so we went there and we found out about how to make CMOS image sensor. And so Davis was actually the first neuromorphic camera built in a CMOS image sensor process. So let me tell you what's different about that. So here you have a CMOS layer down here with the transistors sitting in the N and P wells and the multiple levels of metal. What you get in a CMOS image sensor process is micro lenses that focus the light onto the photodiode instead of just wasting it onto this metal. You also get RGB color filters optionally, which can filter the colors out that you don't want to see in a particular pixel. You also get an anti-reflection coating that improves the quantum efficiency. And you get special photodiodes. For example, this buried photodiode here, it's a normal PN junction, but the surface is covered with the same type as the substrate. So the bulk of the junction is actually buried inside the bulk to reduce the dark current and junction leakage and recombination at the surface. Usually at this interface here, there are a lot of mid-band traps, which increase the recombination rate and reduce the quantum efficiency. And so this is just called a buried photodiode because you have to contact it still through some contact here, which is heavily doped. You also get special implants like this deep P implant. This is, say, a P substrate. And this deep P implant can push the photoelectrons, the N photoelectrons, towards the photodiode and shield and isolate your N FETs and your P FETs here. So you have to understand all these different layers, and this is just really simple in view because you're building a pin photodiode pixel, there's even more cryptic layers. So it's complicated. Yeah, you can do other things too in a CMOS image sensor fab. Like for example, they can thin the wafer down and put micro lenses on the back. And then you have a back illuminated sensor. So then all the metal's not in the way of the light. And that's called a backside illuminated sensor. And we built a Davis like that too. And you do that if you really want higher quantum efficiency. And almost all sensors now are backside illuminated in that way. So the Davis had a big impact. I mean, I think Labs and Innovation sold more than 2,000 of them, and they enabled frame event fusion work. And you can see here, this is one of the first movies we got with Christian Brandley catching a football. You see the frames and the events. You can see how the events in slow motion especially go ahead of the frames because they're output concurrently while the frame is being integrated. The global shutter frame. Global shutter means that all pixels start and stop their integration at the same moment. So you don't have motion artifacts. Yeah, the problem with this Davis, of course, is rather poor image quality. Only about 50 dB dynamic range and only has the resolution of the DBS, which is not what biology does. Biology has a sustained pathway with higher resolution. And so we realized this problem way long time ago, and nobody knows about this work. But around 2015, Cheng-Han Lee, as a PhD student at that time, finished his PhD project, and he designed the C Davis, which is the first now known in industry as hybrid vision sensor, because it's a heterogeneous pixel array of APS active pixel sensor and DBS pixels. And you can see that here. Here is one macro pixel. I hope you guys can see the mouse. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. And what you have is one Davis pixel. And this chip, actually, the Davis didn't really work. So it's just DBS events with no color filter on it. The capacitors and so on are all stretched out between the pixel. And then it's surrounded by red, green, and blue 4-transistor global shutter pin photodiode active pixel sensor pixels. And so you see here, a pin photodiode is also a buried photodiode, but the junction never comes to the surface. So you actually transfer all the charge onto the flooding diffusion. So you get very high, very low dark current, and ideally perfect correlated double sampling to remove the reset noise. So you have a Bayer pattern of this RGB frame pixels together with the DBS pixels. And here is one of the few sample videos we have from that. This is the Macbeth color checker chart, and these red and these black and white things here are the DBS events. This color image has a resolution of 640 by 480, and the DBS events have a resolution of quarter VGA, 320 by 240. That worked. You know, the chip actually works. We still have thousands of them, actually, because it's a dedicated wafer run. We really never pursued the idea of making a camera, but because we had the Davis at that time. As you can see, again, here, this is the output in space-time from this spinning bar. You get this helix of events in space-time, and then you can get these colored frames. And what you want to see in the Macbeth color checker chart is that you get nice gray levels here after you do all the color correction, and that all these colors are actually the same as you see them. That's one of those charts that you buy, cost like $200, perfectly calibrated, that are used all the time in image sensor business. Here's another video, only 4 seconds long, of outdoor traffic scene with the C Davis. I'll play it again. You can see the cars and then the frames. Here, the color quality is not very good. Really, we had only a tiny bit of data from this sensor, but I do have the camera here, because the innovation took our motherboard and they actually built this prototype. It got put in a drawer. It runs. I'll plug it in here. I'll show you. And so it's SMOP. It's just SMOP. You know what that means? Simply a matter of programming to get it to work. We play it here for you. How can I get to it? It's this thing over here. You see that thing up on the upper right? Okay, so these are totally out of focus. Yeah, so somehow I can't get the signed events out. I guess it's making DBS events. Yeah, it's hard to see it because it's focused, and the events aren't signed. Somehow the polarity is messed up. I'll put my hand. The hand you can always recognize. Your head has lots of hand cells in it. That's why hands are good. And now it also makes frames, but the color's all messed up. That was my project here at Telluride, to get this thing running again. Okay, so that was the C Davis, which, you know, actually is the first camera that could be actually supplied to other people of this form, because getting these chips out of these big semiconductor companies is almost impossible. Anyway, around the period of 2017 to 2020, the big industry players got involved, Samsung, Sony, and then OmniVision, and they started building industrial backside illuminated and stacked wafer DBS cameras. And the concept is extremely simple. You just stack 2 wafers together, and each pixel are bonded together by a copper bump. You can do that down at the micron level, 2 micron level. You can make a bump in each pixel when they're down to a pitch of maybe 2 or maybe 3 microns. Trust me, it's not cheap, you know, to do this, right? To get the yield up and everything, it's complicated. And so the first industrial backside illuminated DBS was from Samsung. And then the first stacked DBS was simultaneously almost from Samsung at ISCAS 2020 and Sony at ISSC 2020. Sony Prophecy, I think. It's probably the Gen 4 chip. Prophecy. Is that correct? Okay. Yeah, so the idea is, in this particular example, the Sony top wafer is a 90 nanometer backside illuminated top wafer, and then the bottom is 40 nanometer CMOS. And this camera, which is here, gets a pitch of 4.9 microns and about 77% fill factor. So almost all the pixel is, actually exposed to light. And of course, they put photodiodes and anti-reflection coating and all the stuff that a big industry camera maker has in their fab, which is really hard to get access to as an academic. And you can see that the only connection here is between the top layer. It only has a couple of transistors, a couple of MFETs, and everything else is on the bottom wafer. Like 40 transistors, or mostly partly analog and partly digital on the bottom CMOS. Any questions about that? Well, I thought you had to go to LA, John. You want to split the lighting set? Oh, tomorrow. Okay. Poor guy. Okay. Okay, so now let me show you the most recent industrial sensors. There were 3 papers out of the 8 papers in the image sensor section of ISSCC Solid State Circuits Conference, which is the El Primo conference to get your chip paper into. 3 out of 8 papers were some kind of event camera last year. And this is not as complicated as it looks. This is the second paper from Saudi. And the bottom part of the chip, it's a frame event camera. How can I explain it? Basically, you have the stacked wafers here with copper-copper connections. And then you have the pixel array. And the pixel array, I'm going to show you in a moment, has these color filters in this particular pattern. Then to read out the frames, you have column A to D converters. You have row drivers. You have event control and RGB color control. You have an event signal processor, an event drop filter, an event compression digital block. And then there's an image signal processor, highly developed IP blocks from these big image sensor companies that do a lot of things like demosaicing, offset correction, gamma correction, and all the stuff you need to get good pictures out of these things. And then there's an interface of some type here. And the idea of this thing is that it takes a sequence of frames and also a sequence of event frames, which are sparse frames that are highly compressed on readout. So they've abandoned the asynchronous readout in this architecture to make the pixel smaller. The way this works is in a block of 4x4 pixels, you have 2 pixels red, 2 pixels blue. Those are APS pixels. 8 green pixels, also image pixels, and then 4 white pixels. It looks gray here, but it's actually white, no color filter, which are event pixels. And I'm zooming up here on what's going on in the pixel array. The clever thing they did here is that they time multiplex. And whether this stands the test of time or not is yet to be seen because nobody has their hands on these cameras to play with them. They actually, here, the image sensor pixel is very simple. You see, in this case, it's a mobile, it looks simple, but it's one of their mobile camera pixels, highly optimized. This is what you get in the most expensive smartphones, these kind of pixels. They have a picture of 1.2 microns. This picture is 1.2 microns. And it has its own photodiode. It has the resets, the transfer gate that transfers the charge onto the floating diffusion, the reset transistor, and then the source follower input, the row select, and then this goes out onto row lines to go to the column parallel ADD converters. And then the DVS pixel on the top wafer just has this little circuit. There's a copper bump. And then this is the interesting part, the event pixel analog front-end array time multiplexes the change detection. This is log intensity here. You recognize a logarithmic photoreceptor here. This little exponential here does the work of turning the linear photocurrent into log voltage. Anyway, they sample that here at the desired event frame rate, and then they sequentially check whether it's an on event or an off event with this shared comparator. So then they can switch in globally the on voltage, the off voltage, and the reset voltage to check whether you have an event in that pixel in that frame. And then in the readout circuit from this whole array, they do a lot of compression here. For example, if a row of pixels doesn't have any events, then they skip it.
What if there's multiple events for one event, right?
It's not possible. You're limited to this frame rate, which can go up to thousands of frames a second, up to about 4,000, I think, frames a second.
That's something that's not like multiplex. That mean it's like half of one that.
You get at most 1 event per pixel per DVS frame, per event frame, they call it. They don't call it DVS because we unfortunately trademarked that, right? I agree. So unfortunately. Now, this pixel array is really big, 35 megapixel. 35 megapixels. So it's a pretty big Sony chip, even though it's built in a 90 nanometer top and 22 nanometer bottom technology. This is like the state-of-the-art mass production Sony image sensor fab with all the stuff that they can do, which is the best in the world. And here's the sample output. You see the frame here, RGB frame, and this is one event frame from this rapidly spinning fan. You can read sensor, CMOS, image.
But you're saying that it says one event per binary, you're saying?
Yes, the binary, one event per.
But this looks like a bit like grayscale.
Yeah, because they probably collapsed multiple frames here, multiple DBS frames. Remember, this is 22 nanometer digital, so you can get really fast, like really fast. Yeah, so that's the Sony chip that was published last year, as I say in ISSCC. Pretty impressive chip, you know. I mean, not breathtaking in its innovation, circuit innovation, but impressive in its technology. Because you can bet this costs like probably $5 million at least, this whole development. Now, I'm almost finished actually. I want to show you the OmniVision, which is even more impressive in some way. OmniVision is probably the number 2 or 3. So Sony's number 1, and then Samsung and OmniVision trade places to be the number 2 image sensor provider in the world. I'm talking about mass production, 100 million chips per year, or even more, hundreds of millions of chips per year. This looks really complicated, but I'm going to break it down for you. So they do the same thing as we did and as Sony did. They have a macro pixel with lots of color image sensor pixels and 1 DBS pixel. And it's a 3 wafer stack in this case. And it's backside illumination, so the light is actually shining in the back of this top wafer here. And on this top wafer, you have micro lenses, color CFA is color filter array, right now micro lenses. PPD is pin photodiode. Remember I talked about this pin photodiode where you can completely transfer the charge onto the photo diffusion. And they have pin photodiode. They have the NFETs that you need for APS, like the source follower readout. And they have the DBS photodiode, which is it's actually a pin photodiode too, but they run it basically like a buried photodiode. And then there's 1 copper bump per macro pixel per 16 pixels. So 1 copper bump for this macro pixel to the middle wafer. Is it clear so far? Okay, so that's the top wafer. There's another copper bump here at the edge, I guess for ground. Okay, and then the middle wafer does all the event camera stuff. So you'll recognize here in this middle wafer, I'm not sure if you guys in the back can see it, but this middle wafer has the DBS circuit. Now let's trace through how this works. You see the copper bump? Here's the photocurrent flowing down this way, copper bump, and it flows right into the log photoreceptor circuit. They actually sum up all the photocurrents so they can read them out over the whole array. And so there's the log photoreceptor. Here's the source follower that buffers its output. Here's the change detector, just exactly the switch cap change detector with a bias on it to enable them to move the high pass corner up a bit. Normally the high pass corner is down at a 1/10 of a hertz or so at room temperature. You can make it higher if you want if you don't want to see slow stuff. And I think the Prophecy sensors have that, and the Sony sensors, Samsung sensors have this bias to enable to block slower motion. Then here are the comparators that detect on and off events. Then there's a block here that does memory and handshake. I'm not sure what this stuff is, somehow biased. And then additionally, in each of these macro pixels, they have a TDC, which is a time to digital converter, a 4-bit time to digital converter, so they can timestamp the event in each of these macro pixels with a 16-bit timestamp. It gives them additional timing accuracy. Okay, then we get to the bottom wafer where the heavy lifting digital processing is done by means of these through silicon vias. These through silicon vias, you can't build at the pixel level. They're too coarse, but you can make through silicon vias at the edge of the die. These through silicon vias then connect across from the top wafer to the very bottom wafer. They don't connect to the middle wafer. these through silicon vias then allow them to read out the frames from these color pixels. And on this bottom wafer, they have additionally the APS readout with ADD converter. By the way, this state-of-the-art image sets have very sophisticated ADD converters, not just like a 10-bit, single slope ADD converter. They're really fancy. You all kind of flipping of things and error correction and stuff. And then they also have a big block down here, which is the event signal processor that does some denoising and compression and stuff like that. Then they also have the standard image signal processor, the ISP, and they also have, of course, because they're industry, the MIPI interface, the mobile industry processor interface with standard smartphone interface. In no way academic group is going to have all these IP blocks around. This is only a major corporation that can afford these blocks. Yeah, so that's the OmniVision thing. Again, I think it's about 25 megapixels APS and about maybe 4 megapixel or 1 megapixel DBS. And they chose 16 to 1 here, 15 to 1. 15 color, frame pixels and 1 DBS pixel. And thanks to Andreas Swiss, OmniVision supplied these videos. This is the only industry players able to get video from. In this case, the camera is used to do various corrections which are useful on smartphones. For example, the rolling shutter distortion correction. Do you guys know what rolling shutter distortion is? Normal camera, I guess this is a rolling shutter, not a global shutter camera. Rolling shutter means that the pixels are exposed at different times during the frame. It's a rolling shutter like the old slide shutter that you had on a film camera. And if you have a rolling shutter sensor, you get things called motion artifacts, where a rotating thing will look curved. And what they do is they use the DBS events to correct that rolling shutter distortion. Here, you can see that these edges are curved, perhaps slightly curved. Here, by using the DBS events and some kind of DNN, which they don't specify, some kind of ConfUNet probably, they get rid of this distortion. So these edges turn nice and straight. You get nice color frames coming out without these artifacts.
Do you do the running maps close to the chip, or is that all your post processing?
It's all done on a GPU. It's all basically, they barely got the chip working, I'm sure. They managed to collect some data from it, and then they rolled out quickly trained some DNN to try to solve this problem. That a lot of people involved, right? A lot of professional engineers who can get stuff done quickly, not like PhD students. I mean, they're pros, right? They know how to get stuff done quickly. Now here in this case, they do blurring. You notice that on this image, I don't know if can you guys in the back see that these edges are quite blurred? Yeah, that's the motion blur that you get from standard APS because the edge is passing along while you're exposing it. Yeah. And so by using the DBS events, let me hide this here. By using the DBS, you can sharpen up and de-blur the picture. And also get rid of the rolling shutter distortion. So finally, as their piece de resistance, please say that in French for me. Somebody says that properly. Yeah, as their showcase, they show the slow motion video where the frames are coming out at 120 frames a second. This is a high resolution sensor, but they can read the frames at 120 frames a second. But they managed to produce this slow motion video where you can't even see it, but the balloon is exploding there. You see that? And then all the water coming out from this water balloon, all these droplets are spraying out. Well, this is like 5,000 frames equivalent. I'm sure for this, actually, this is not what Davide Scaramucci's group did with their ConfUNet. They never did frame event fusion. They just did high-speed reconstruction from DBS events. But I guess it wasn't a big step to do frame event fusion and produce super slow mo from it. But now they also do too. Well, that was quick. I'm done. That's all I'm going to show you today.
QUBO, as we in last server, so I will first talk about the formulation of the problem. So what we have is the periodic unconstrained binary operator problem. So this in itself is an NP-hard explorer problem. So this is in the function here is the cost function for this problem is in quadratic form, and I will explain the symbols in detail later.
And people often, in order to solve this kind of problem, people often draw parallel of QUBO problem to ISING machine. So ISING machine is coming from physics. It's basically the energy of paramagnetic speed lattice network. So I will also explain the symbol on this side to draw parallel between these two kinds of formulation of same kind of problem. So for the quadratic gun constraint problem, the QUBO problem, so the Q here is a real matrix in the D by D dimension. It's the connectivity matrix, and to draw parallel in the ISING model, here we have J, which is the interaction matrix between every speed. So every entry Ij in the matrix J represents the interaction between speed I and speed J. So it can also take on real values. So when the Jij is greater than 0, it's the interaction is called paramagnetic. And when the interaction is when the Jij is smaller than 0, it's called anti-paramagnetic. When it's 0, there's no interaction between the two states. So the state variable in the QUBO form is just a binary vector that in the D dimension of space, it takes on values of 0 and 1s. In the ISING model case, we have the spin variable, which takes on +1 and -1 space. So here there's a bit of difference between these two models, but as we see later, they are interchangeable in a very simple way. So in the ISING energy, there's an additional term that except for the quadratic term. So this H is the external field that's also affecting the magnetic network. So the function here, the objective function in the QUBO form is just the objective function and describes the cost of the current state. It basically maps a state to a real value that tells how optimized the solution is. And the same case is applied to the ISING model, which also maps this d-dimensional speed vector to a real value energy. So we want to minimize this energy.
So is there a constraint on this connectivity like that Q has to be symmetric or some unit?
Yeah, the Q is upper triangular in the QUBO form, and Q is symmetric in the ICD.
But you can always symmetrize it. You can always add transpose. So that is what I'm
yeah. So as I mentioned before, there's a bit of difference between the state representation in these two forms. So but we can simply use a substitution here to transfer IC model to QUBO and vice versa. And we can also make H0 fixed.
Okay, first, just to make sure, does everyone know what spin means here? But the idea that's why we talk about spin in the first place, this might be completely non-substitute on keyboard. So anyone who has no idea what was spin here?
Let's say no. So the spin is basically a magnetic dipole. So they're connected in a lattice. So when the neighboring dipole are in the same direction, they have more energy. And when the neighboring dipole are in the different direction, they have a higher energy. That's our spin is here.
That's what people would use this, for example, to explain if you have a metal, and then like how does a magnetic field how does a metal magnetize? And you have these different regions that can be magnetized one direction or in the other direction. And when you're trying to model like how does this actually emerge, these pentons, like what is magnetized in which direction? And it all happens through local interactions. Like you have rid of these atoms, and each of the atoms can have a spin burst development, whatever, and they are talking to each other like nearest neighbor interactions. And they might be interacting in the sense that two neighboring things want to have the same spin, or the two neighboring atoms want to have opposite spins. That would here in the ISING one would be represented by a positive or a negative weighted between neighboring nodes, basically. Right? So it's one of the different systems have to describe all sorts of systems where you have interaction between neighbors.
Yes. So this probably the question which arises in the upper type I said. So when people say they actually like neighbors, but the J matrix of first like the everything.
Like when I say neighbors, basically the connected ones are neighbors. They can be physically very far apart. They can be, but usually the ISING model is describing a lattice, so that neighbor is used in that context.
There are different types of ISING first. So there are lattice-based ISING models. So J has a very specific diagonal, right?
So there has been attempts in all kinds of domains to solve the ISING model. They're called ISING machines. There are a lot of details in this graph, but you don't need to worry about it. So basically, this is a memory-resistant crossbar network. So how do we solve it? So we first program the conductance with the Q matrix from the last slide. Basically, the connectivity matrix in the QUBO form and the Hamiltonian matrix in the energy matrix, the interaction matrix in the ISING model. So we first program the conductance with that, and then we drive the network with the spin states represented as voltages here. So we drive the network in the green crossbar, and then we compute the gradient. Basically, is Q times S as current. And then we read out the current and we'll do the update on the voltage and on this side. So there's a optimization loop. So whenever there's a state, and then we compute the current gradient, and based on the gradient, we update the next iteration state. So there are some challenges for this kind of machine. First one is scalability. So for a memory-resistant network, it's pretty simple, right? How many crossbar you have is a constraint. You can only put a graph that has smaller size than your crossbar network onto the actual crossbar. So scalability is a pretty straightforward issue with that, and also there's a performance guarantee because the combinatorial problems are really hard. It's really hard to obtain a ground truth. But people generally go with fully enough solutions. But what if we want to do discovery? Well, what if we just want to have a guaranteed convergence to ground state? So it's really hard to get this kind of performance guarantee for a lot of current ISING machines.
So the reason why we chose ISING as one of the problems for the Neuromorphic advantage is that if you have a chip with 800 neurons and you show that you can find the novel solution, that itself is a pretty good remarkable results. So even for this type of a network, as Zihao would show, 50 is the current state of art. So after that, all the non-idealities and all the artifacts are showing. So even if you make a small chip and show that it can accelerate the state of the art result, that's it.
So a little bit more detail in that. So here we're updating the space with a gradient, but there's a bit more to this in this stage. Most of the time, just following the gradient descent won't give you very good solutions. One technique that people use is inject noise in this space, or in some of the compute space. So that's that. So this is a graph that shows what an ideal ISING machine would look like. So there's a lot of information going on. I will first explain the axis. So the x-axis here is the size of the problem. So we have like different categories. We have small problem, medium problem, large problems, and this y-axis is the solution quality. Basically, how optimized the solution we're getting, and this frequency is a bit abstract. So to get to a solution, usually you need to run the same algorithm multiple times to get to the solution. So the frequency means that the solution we get across many methods. So on this green line shows the state-of-art solution, which has been known to many which has been known based on previous literatures. So this is the benchmark we're trying to beat. But because for small problem, it's easy to iterate over all the solution space. So we can safely say that the current state of our solution is actually the ground state. But for medium large graph, like when the graph complexity goes up, it's really hard to obtain the ground state by brute force iterating through all the possible combinations. So we don't know if the current state of R is actually the ground state. So we make a speculation here that the ground state may actually deviate from the state of our plane. So for the non-optimal ISING solvers, for small problems, because it's easy, so across many runs, we can always get to the state of R. But the frequency starts to diffuse a little bit when the problem size increases for the non-ideal, non-optimal ISING machines. So the blue shade here is actually the frequency obtained by a supposedly non-optimal ISING machine. So you can see that across many runs, the frequency of getting to the state of R is still high, but you have this tail where across many runs you can see like not so optimal solutions. And for more complex problem, the non-optimal ISING machine will perform even worse. So the peak of the distribution, the solution distribution will even move away from the state of R, so that it will get a heavy tail on the non-optimal solution side. So for an optimal ISING machine, what we want to achieve is that for a small graph, we want to achieve the state of our solution with high success rate. And then for a medium and large graph, we want it's really hard to avoid the diffusion completely. But we want the diffusion. We want the frequency of the solution of the obtained solution to diffuse less, so that across many runs we still get to the state of our solution for the most of the time. And in addition to that, because we also want to address the challenge of performance guarantee, instead of merely achieving a state of R, we also want to find if there's another better solution to comparing to the current state of R solution. So that's with the tail over here.
So any question about this value? You have shit. So what do you mean by size? Size is like basically the number that of the split states.
The letters of the split states. It's the letters of states. The split states also relates to it's equivalent to the side of the graph.
Right. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, because it's really hard to describe the complexity of a combinatorial problem. We're just using size as standard.
I see. Yeah, because I was thinking about it as far as, but maybe it doesn't fit this context well. Where if you have an n by n matrix, right? But a lot of it is zero, and you just basically go to the non-zero pathway, then the size, in quotes, becomes smaller. But I don't think that fits this context because you're doing sort of a Rubik's cube. Thing.
Yeah, the zeros in the connecting matrix basically is also affecting the shape of the energy contribution. So it's really hard to handle with.
I see. Yeah. There also no simple measure to one is easy and one is hard, right? But that's we had in the paper we looked at all sorts of different graphs because of that, because no one can really say this is a hard graph to solve it. Forecasts.
Just to clarify, frequency is like you are initializing as each time you're running the descent, and then checking if you get, say, all those.
Yes, and it doesn't necessarily have to be graded to any kind of optimization problem. So just run multiple iterations.
Also, question: why, when you get large size, you get some solutions the state of the art and some of the state?
Oh yeah, this so it's eventually we want to. So this is the phase where we're only getting one better solution than the current state of art. But to get to the ground state, we might need a lot of time. So basically here we're saying that this kind of as a time domain, but it's not. It might be confusing too. So this basically what we want to convey in this case is that if we let the optimal IC machine run long enough, we could get to ground state with a high frequency. Okay, but if you're just running in a fixed amount of time, you will be getting ground state against their state. Yeah. She could be anywhere on that line. So let's see a real mapping of a combinatorial problem to ISING chain. So this is also a benchmark that we use in our paper, and also people have literature have extensively studied this kind of problem. So it's called MaxCut. It's basically a graph partitioning problem. So what we do is that what we want to achieve is that there are 5 nodes in this graph, right? We want to divide this 5 nodes into 2 sets, such that the edges that cross these 2 sets is maximized. So in this case, we have this kind of partition. So these 2 nodes are the same set. These 3 nodes are the same set. So in this case, we're cutting all the 5 edges, which means that we're maximizing the cuts between the 2 sets. So to connect to ISING model, we want to denote this two states with up speed and down speed, basically -1 and 1. So here, the black, I forgot the color code, but it's either black or white that represents the -1 or +1. And MaxCut is remember that when I introduced QUBO and ISING machine, they all take on the connectivity matrix, all takes on real values. But for MaxCut specifically, we're looking at adjacency matrix with discrete values, so that they only take on -1, 0, +1. So to calculate the number of cuts in this graph, it's basically saying that if this two spin is connected through QIJ, and they have same sign, which will make this term 0. But if SI and SJ have negative signs, which means that they are from different sides, this will take on a non-zero value. So we want to maximize this term, so this basically calculates the number of cuts on with the current space assignment. So how do we map this to a quadratic optimization binary unconstrained quadratic unconstrained binary operator problem? Is simply simple as that. This is an ISING formulation with -1 and +1, but you can do a variable change and go to QUBO, which is 0 and 1. So
it's like the intellectual memory. It's easier to visualize for people like those. MaxCut is equal to saying you want neighboring nodes to have opposite spin if possible, as much as possible. And so the black ones in the top right corner are kind of not happy about it. They have the same spin and they're neighboring, but this is one of the configurations that overall that's the lowest energy. So in this case, as many neighboring, the pairs of neighboring you all have opposite spin. How do you get the QIJ? What's involved?
it's given to you. If QIJ, now that's a separate interesting. When you learn QIJ, that's a different problem. But most of the time, the graph is given.
So in MaxCut is always is terminally then, right? So
There is a weighted MaxCut. You can think of this as a classification problem.
correct.
Right? It's this, that partition is classifying the edges
Yes.
based on this.
But why is QIG prediction from to you?
No, it doesn't make so here and so very
And then you can also, it has a relationship with SVM.
Yeah, but it's a binary problem. It's a combinatorial problem.
But then also you have this quadratic formulation. So
Yes, so this loss function shows up in many places. The only key difference is that there are only 2 discrete values there. That's no, and that's why it's hard.
So
So I'll now talk about like what's the current state of art. Maybe you go back to the previous slide. One thing I must add. So in this formulation, because the string states -1 and 1, you can always do this. So I can always add some distant square because S square is always 1, right? So which means that I can always add a diagonal term key. And I won't change the cost function. And why this is useful is you can make Chile, if this is not positive definite, you can make it positive.
Right.
So then it becomes an actual energy. So in many of the analog mapping on this will be useful.
But then we have a unique solution.
No, then it's still this is still a that takes discrete values. So even then it's combinatorially hard. Yes.
Yes.
So no, I'll talk about what's the current stuff art is doing. So this table basically is the table of the benchmarks. So each entry is a different benchmark problem, benchmark mascot problem. So I'll explain. So node is just the graph size, number of nodes in the graph, and edges is the number of edges that's in the connectivity matrix. So in this case, in this graph, in G1, the weight is only either 0 or positive 1, but there are cases where we have negative weights as well.
I think you shared with Irish because you went on present mode and you have to check the box. You was using a laser pointer that was timing instead of automatically advanced producing because of
My opinion is because he's touching it.
so the suggestion touch it was laser pointer. Oh, it's yeah. That's fancy. Think of possibilities in there.
The screen is touch it should last. Don't worry about it. Okay.
Yeah.
So the type of the graph is basically there are so when it's random, so everything is scrambled. There are other kinds of layouts of the graph. The layouts of the graph will basically affect the finals, the average sign out or the maximum finals of the graph for each node.
What is all again?
So I didn't mean that there's a structure to the graph.
Yes, there are other structures to it. So I'm only taking snapshots. So it's basically G1 through G17. There are a bunch of this kind of benchmarks. So the target here, the target is the state of our solution. This everyone is targeting. So there's no known solution that's better than the target. So I took this snapshot from a final blog that's coming from one of the company that designed it ISING machine. So this time is their time to solution, and the results is their results. So this is the difference to the target. So the DSAT benchmarks are publicly available online. I also parsed the data in a more easier to operate way. So I also have it on share folders as well. So, so the most I wouldn't say efficient, but this is the Fujitsu simulated annealing chip. It's a digital annealer chip. So this one, the blog didn't say where they got the state of our solution from, but I would assume that it's coming from some kind of a simulated annealing type of machine. So this is one of the commercially available, and it's also pretty good. So a little bit about simulated annealing, how simulated annealing, what is it and how it works. So before jumping into the algorithm itself, so I first want to introduce a greedy algorithm in optimizing this kind of problem. So the vector here is the speed state at some point of time. So we're adopting the color coding before. So the whites are the negative one spin and blacks are the positive one spins. So So we randomly select a neuron P, and now flip the state of the neuron P, and calculate how much energy has changed. So in a gradient way, if the delta change is smaller than 0, means that we go down in the energy contour. We accept the flip. But if there's no benefit in doing that, we just decline the flip and we reverse it. So what's the problem with a greedy algorithm? So this is the energy contour, arbitrary energy contour. So the y-axis is the ISING energy, and x-axis is the different spin states. So say we're at the local minimum at this point. So by adopting the greedy algorithm, we basically are stuck because every slip we like an increase in energy. So we're stuck at local minimum. So what people want to achieve is that quantum domain, right? We instead of stacking at a local minimum from fluctuation, and we can actually tunnel through this energy barrier and get to the global minimum. So how do we simulate this kind of dynamics? So we accept the raw slip with some probability, with a finite probability. So this allows us to gradually go up to make a sequence of round flips and go up in energy, and then we can descend to a more favorable state in energy. So in this case,
Is it possible to have multiple flips just to accelerate?
Initially, so I will get to that, but the quick answer is that initially it's kind of fault tolerant, but to get to the optimal solution, you still need a sequential type of operation. Yeah.
Do you like to iterate through all of these different flips, like when it's time you feel all parallel, and like if you're iterating, you take into account like the neighbor state before or already got flips the next state? Yep, that's exactly the problem. So like if you have many at the same time, the energy difference you're computing for each one is wrong because you're extending based on the previous step sense. But now you're flipping many at the same time. So that's why as you go towards that, you want to like, I think at least currently we want to go like to get slow enough that you only flipping one at a time, which is that it's we never talk about that. So that's the problem.
That's for simulating it. I will also show at the end of the presentation, there's a slide that's showing that we're actually getting diminishing returns for longer time.
Also, can we have a second order moment? Like switched out first.
Yeah. So there's I have a speculation that for the later results. So basically, it's the stiffness of the energy that kind of, I'm speculating from experiment results, but I'm thinking that the stiffness of the energy contour actually plays a role in there, because for simulated annealing is somehow trapped in the global in the optimal. It's trapped in the solution basically at the end of the optimization.
So all the tricks, the momentum, they work only in the initial part of the optimization. So most of what in a combinatorial optimization problem, at least with this, the energy contour looks something like this. You need to get, and then there is this one nice global optima that we want to get to. I think here you can accelerate using parallel updates, momentum, whatever you want. Once you get here, then you have to do a brute force search. Then all the other tricks you have to try. So that's where, at this point, you have to select one spin at a time or some other sampling method to get to this one. So is it always like this? The range solves? Well, so this part, what it means that there is some information in the gradient that you can follow the gradient to get to this point. After that, everything looks flat. So you have to look at some heuristics. Noise. Yeah, noise. That's where the noise statistics become very important.
Yep. So just following that, noise actually here. So eventually we translate this update rule with this. So this is a random variable. that's coming from this equation. So I explained about each of the variables here. So Tn is the time, it's a non-increasing temperature term. So it's kind of going down in time. So this is where also the annealing, the name come from. And Un is a random variable that's from uniform distribution from 0 to 1. And then P is a happy parameter that's greater than 1, which ensures that this whole thing is always greater than 0, so that we never reject a good flip. So this epsilon term here is just to make the log stable, so that there's never log 0.
Yeah, but maybe just put the bit lower in the sampling tutorial before. But this is exactly what we were ending up with. Like this equation, if you exponentiate all of this x, we'll get back to this other form. Like some Metropolis says, it's the same idea. So the exactness probability actually depends on the change in energy at the atom. Now, we also kind of curious, simulator you could use it as a heuristic method. Is there something special about simulator name that makes it good for the QUBO problem, which is genetic algorithms, storage algorithm? Is that something special?
So I think the question, the answer would be the time decaying temperature schedule. So there's I think it's lower bound. So you can, anytime, any temperature schedule that's decaying faster than a certain schedule, there's no guarantee to get a ground state. But any schedule that's slower than a certain schedule will give you the asymptotic guarantee, the infinite one. So when t equals to infinity, we are guaranteed to reach the goals, the ground state.
Yeah, I still think that there might be another heuristic on there that we're trying. So when we are thinking about designing a chip, we want it to be this. That we want this part to be accelerated. So this is the matrix vector multiplication.
Actually, we can't see the screen. We can't see your screen.
Yes, and we have to figure out.
Oh, you can't see the screen.
Yes. Well,
Can we see it now? Yes.
yeah. So we need a mechanism to accelerate this part, and then we need the flexibility to inject any type noise of any arbitrary space. So all the heuristics that you're talking about, we can actually program on the chip. Also, what's kind of hidden here is how do you select the candidate that.
Oh yeah, I'll get to it. Yep. So this so we want to emulate the dynamics of simulated annealing in a Neuromorphic way. So we so from that side we end up with this flip criteria. So this would may look similar to familiar to some of you. So we actually view this delta H as the random potential, and then this mu and this random number as a noisy threshold. So whenever the random potential across this noisy threshold, we accept the flip. Basically means that the neuron fires and that flip is silent. So to get to the algorithm, I will first introduce some terminology here, some variable names. So the V-map, the random potential is a 1/n vector that's recording the delta H for every neuron. So there's a bit of subtlety there because in classical simulated annealing, we're calculating delta H as a scalar, but here random potential is for every neuron. So the intrinsic way to understand it is that the random potential in this context basically means that how much energy would have changed if we were to flip this neuron. So that if there's more benefit to flip this neuron, there's a higher probability to get flipped, and that's what random potential here means. And then the S is the state variable that's we have seen before. Is basically the spin state. We attach a spin state to every neuron in the network. It's also 1/n vector. that has the trace of value of either -1 or +1.
What is the third one in this?
Yeah.
What is the third row?
Third row, I haven't got into that. So third row is the spikes. It's basically it's denoted as ES delta. It's basically the change of the neuron state. So say if the neuron flips from -1 to 1, the change is positive. So spike is positive. If the neuron state change from 1 to -1, so positive to negative, the DS, the spike will take on that -1 value.
So how do you get the negative spike?
Yeah, we have a way to get around with negative spike.
It's the neurons.
Yes, neurons basically. Yeah, simple differential neuron. Yes. So Q is just the connectivity matrix. It's the value takes on our values, discrete values, and P is the set of spiking neurons. So ideally, we want P on average to be 1. We only want 1 neuron to spike at a time. So the algorithm goes like this. So the neuron spikes if the number potential across across the noisy threshold, and then for the neuron that spikes, we flip the sign of the neuron, and that update the spike of this neuron. So whenever there's a change from positive to negative, we have a negative spike. Whenever there's a change from negative to positive, we have positive spike.
So it's a interplay between inhibition and excitation.
Yeah. So to get around with the negative spike, we have a inhibition and excitatory connection within the neuron. So we update the non-potential using delta S and Q. So non-potential is recording the delta H, which essentially is Q times P, so that whenever there's a neuron flip the sign, it's emitting spikes and let the connected neuron know that, see, I flip my side, right? So that
How do you control the many neurons could fire?
yes.
I just suppose there only one neuron would fire.
Essentially, you want to control the fire dynamics with the designing the design of the noisy threshold. We design the noisy threshold such that when the threshold is applied to every neuron, there's only one spike on average. And in simulation, we have different mechanisms. We just pick one neuron and flip the sign.
So the intrinsic assumption here is that the spike is actually a delta function.
What? It's a time study.
Yeah, there's only one neuron that spikes. So now that's where the hardware acceleration comes in, because as soon as it spikes, you need to propagate that as quickly as possible. So otherwise, some of the assumptions are not going to work.
So the delta has to be really small. So ultimately, your obtain should be smaller than your
Yes.
feedback.
Yes, so that's where the acceleration part comes, that you need how quickly propagate that setting.
So you can imagine this is running at 1 gig and your updates are running at 2 megahertz. And then we just push it pocket.
And in the initial part of the algorithm, even if multiple neurons spike, that should be okay because it converted down the grade.
Or maybe you could do it just whenever first spike fires, we limit all the others. So it doesn't fire. That could be done right.
There's also mechanism what we call inhibitive firing. Basically, it's what you said, like we record all the spikes and basically not need one power gain.
Yeah, well, then you do some inhibition, so it won't fire in the near future.
So like in the Spinnaker implementation, what we did is that as soon as you receive one spike, you ignore all the rest. Yeah, so even if the other spike showed up in the buffer, there's not.
Yeah, but ignoring means you already changed the people, right? Or do you know how she said?
No, it's only one neuron you said. Because we're servicing only.
But they're also fired, right?
Yeah, but
And they're interested in your setting, right? What's the fire? So they're even might have split setting.
but that doesn't matter. It's the membrane potential that.
That's what membrane potential, right? Let's say you have 10 neurons, right? 10 fire. So when they're all 10 fire, they will reset your feedback. All of them reset. And that will change.
So again, here we're updating VMAP using the spike. So because there's only one spike that's being propagated, right? So
No, but that would be local, right?
no, the spike.
That doesn't matter. In the formulation, it actually doesn't matter. You should make it resets itself. centric, normally had situations. Yes, recent by subtraction, some like self-connection. So if you prevent those by, if also you're not sitting there. Yeah, it's not positive. Oh yeah, if it looks like you sit there, but you're not sitting it, then you stop that shit. Yeah, people work with innovation, so from that could be easier. I don't.
Yeah, so to get away with negative spike, we just do a differential so that, so say like positive 1 is encoded as 1 minus 0, and negative 1 is encoded as 0 minus 1. So that's one make the state take some values, so take out binary values basically. So I can show the code at this point because so there's a collab version of it. So you need to first put all the data set, the benchmark in your drive, and then map it to your workspace, and then you can run the algorithm like this. So I will go through this, but basically the idea is that here we take a neuron from the population and then calculate the noise, calculate only one noise threshold, and then compare the threshold to the memory potential and process spike if there's process a spike if there's a spike. I don't think people at the back can see it sufficient. Okay, no, like, yep. So that's that. You'll post this. Yeah, I'll sorry, I think it's on slide for it. So now there's some like the architecture of the algorithm. So we have the traditional max cut problem, and that for every node of the graph, we essentially put an on and off neuron, so differential neuron pair that's encoding the same information, but differential. So for in each of the differential neuron pair, we have this might be a lot of information, but let me just try to break it down. So this side is the presynaptic spikes. So these spikes will get integrated in this units.
And what is this blue and red? That's the plus one y. This connection.
Yeah. It's the plus QIG and minus QIG. Yes. So this is a presynaptic spike, and the spikes gets integrated into the memory potential, and then the memory potential is compared to a noisy threshold. The noisy threshold is coming from somewhere else, and that generates spikes. And there's intrinsic self reset in this case. And the meat in this architecture is the design of this noisy threshold. So this is a simple circuit. I'll just try to explain this. So this Tn is the temperature, so it's decaying over time, and then this is the externally injected exponential random variable. Because recall in the threshold formula, we have log uniform, so that which means that we have exponentially distributed random variable injected from somewhere else, and then we have this Bernoulli random variable that's also injected, also added to this whole thing. So this Bernoulli is doing the random selection, because I was saying that we want the noisy threshold to do the selection for us. So this Bernoulli basically means that there's only one neuron that has a 1, and all the others are zeros. So here I want to show the dynamics of our algorithm on the toy benchmark. So this is the Q matrix. This is an activity matrix of a 10 by 10 max cut problem. It's very simple. The blacks are 1s and whites are 0s. So in this graph, the x-axis is the time in arbitrary unit, basically this number of iterations. And in the y-axis is the distance to optimal solution. Because for a 10 by 10 graph, we can brute force search all the combinations of states, and then calculate and then see where the ground state is. And this is basically the solution we obtained at each time step compared against the optimal solution. So because
this problem, the formulation of the problem basically means that if the two states are complete opposite each other, they are the same state, so that we have actually two global optima, and the maximum distance between them is the distance is just Hamming distance, bitwise Hamming distance. So we're labeling high temperature, low temperature in different time because the temperature is decaying in time. So at some point here, we just choose the time arbitrarily, and so we say that from this point towards the left, it's a high temperature region, and from this point to the right is the low temperature region. So you can see that it's actually it gets trapped. So initially, when the temperature is high, there's a lot of fluctuation going on in here, and then it gets trapped to the global optimum, and then somehow it transfers to another global optimum and gets trapped there. So we plot the network dynamics in a more so use some kind of visualization. So I will explain how we got this trajectory. But you can see that the network dynamics there's a bit of oscillation going on in this region, and there's a bit of oscillation going on in this region, so that the time axis is from here to here. So initially we have high temperature. High temperature, and that's at some point the temperature, we say the temperature slope, and then gradually have this kind of dynamics. So how do we get this kind of dynamics? We do, because the neurons are spiking. So the y-axis is the neuron index, neuron 1 through 10, and the x-axis is the time in terms of iterations. So where we have a moving window that calculates the spiking rate of each neuron, and then do a PCA analysis of the spiking rate and plot it in 3D. But this is a common technique used to understand population band. So what this is showing is initially that the network follows a trajectory, gets stuck in a global optima 1, circulates around, then escapes, and then gets to the global optima. So here it's a small problem, so we know exactly what the global optima are. So, and this is what we want, at least in a low temperature region, that it should explore the state space. So now did you plot this? Yeah, so once you have this population activity, right, you have the spike trains. So you take this window, you clump them together, you get a real number, you calculate the PCA over the entire. You keep only the first 3 most principal components. So that characterizes the energy in the system. And that's the trajectory, time trajectory. Yes, it's an overlapping window.
Is this technique before to analyze dimensional dynamics in this like network? I think it's very cool. I did receive some contentious feedback on, are you really that? Are you not getting rid of a lot of information such that you're maybe oversimplified? If you're looking, especially if you're looking at it for patterns, like you're saying, these groupings in higher dimension, it might not look clustered really.
Yes.
So I don't know. I know it's totally the side to what you're actually presenting. I'm just curious if you have a nice justification that I would totally borrow from you in the future to say PCA is okay.
So for this problem, with this problem, let's say we run the optimizer. What will happen is that the optimizer should get stuck in one of global optima or the other global optima, right? So it means that most of the energy of the trajectories will be this fluctuation, right? And so what we are trying to characterize is that the initial part, it has no relation with respect to these 2 global optima. So what it's showing is that most of the energy of this system, which is this 3 principal components, is practically in this region and in this region. Whereas over here, it just follows an arbitrary trajectory.
Okay, so that's clear.
Yes.
These are kind of like bullet tractors.
Yes, tractors. So you can see that tractors clearly in this stack.
Cool.
So a bit more results. So the different color of dots here is coming from different benchmark problems. So what this plots capture, so I will first explain the axis. So y-axis is time, basically number of iterations. And what's the y-axis? The time to get the next the x-axis is where we are currently at in time into the optimization, into the iteration, and y-axis is how much time you will get to get the unit improvements for the next to get the unit improvement, how much time it would take from current state to get to a better state. So what this essentially means that we're getting a diminishing return. Basically, it's taking much longer to get even a +1 solution towards the end of simulation. So this is towards the end of simulation, and we're getting, so basically the last spot here is consuming all of the iterations. Is there questions for this graph?
So this is actually a big, what it will show is that, yes, so this is the total runtime for the optimizer. And on the y-axis, it's showing to get one improvement in the solution, how much extra time you have to spend. So what is shown over here is that, let's say at this point of the solution solver, it takes about the same amount of time as the total runtime, little more. So the last solution, the best solution, takes most of the time. But getting close to the initial part, it's, it converges pretty quickly. And so most of these ISING models, the bottleneck comes at the convergence, where you have to do a brute force search. So if we can accelerate that part using hardware, then that, that might make a difference.
So this is the frequency of solution that we got. So y-axis is the quality of solution. So 99% means that we're getting 99% of the state of our solution. 1 is state of our solution. Y-axis is the frequency of getting the solution across many runs.
And here my point is, one of the, also the argument to do hardware acceleration is if you can get here. That means that you have found a solution which is better than the state of that. This is where we are saying that okay, you have discovered a new methodology.
Sorry,
yes.
You can't see why I didn't.
Okay. So if you can get to this point, it is even one better than the best known solution. That means that you have found a new topology. So, and the hope is maybe the hardware can push you to this point. Right now, we are limited by the software cycles. So,
now, why would the hardware be able to make this?
because the software, we don't know